Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto Dragon Bloodline Council bashing. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by Soul WINTERFANG71 and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1, Do I Have To? The young man inquired coldly, yet with a hint of trepidation. He wasn't afraid of others. He wasn't afraid of anything. He just didn't like others and they usually didn't like him either. He was the last Slayer alive and Uzumaki who had activated an ancient bloodline that had eventually been diluted through the ages. At the age of 7, he had been attacked by a group of Chunin seeking to kill the demon, the attempt on his life causing him to awaken, which was the first stage of the bloodline. After that, he fled the village and wandered around the world for the past 10 years, gradually coming to control and master his bloodline. It wasn't until almost a year ago that he returned to Konoha and took to living in a cave just beyond the village's outskirts, having found caves far more comfortable than normal houses or apartments. Now, however, he was being forced into attending the academy by the Sandaime Hokage in order to take the Genin exam. Yes, Naruto. You can't keep hiding forever. The elderly Sandaime Hokage replied softly with a warm smile, having become something akin to a grandfather to the young man. They stood outside of a classroom in the academy with Hiruzen in his Hokage robes like usual, while Naruto was hidden beneath a hooded black cloak. Sighing heavily, Naruto slowly and reluctantly removed the final barrier between him and the world, passing it over to the Hokage. Standing at 6'5" with a muscular and lean build and a feral aura, Naruto had bronzed skin that was almost the color of caramel, an array of dark crimson tribal markings covering his body with smaller, more intricate white tribal markings inside the red markings. His once golden blonde hair was now a dark maroon, reaching down to his waist in a shaggy mane that was pulled back into a low ponytail, while his bangs framed his face in rugged curtains that hung down below his broad and muscled chest. His once bright and ever-cheerful blue eyes were now a menacing ruby with thin black slit pupils in either iris, as both red discs floated in pools of ink darker than night. In his jaws, he had 4 sharp fang-like canine teeth that stuck out from behind his lips, slightly amongst teeth that were sharper than what was normal. His fingertips were armed with pitch-black claws, confirmed to be sharp enough to rip and shred metal, as if it were paper, while shorter black claws of identical strength adorned his toes, and his ears were slightly longer than normal and pointed. 3 dark crimson markings decorated either of his cheeks that trailed down the sides of his neck and curled forward, connecting in the center of his chest, where they formed a ring around a white circle. Decorating his entire back was a set of dark crimson tribal markings that formed an image of stylized overlapping scale-like designs, the intricate white markings that filled the red markings, giving the image better detail and clarity. Like usual, he was dressed in a pair of baggy dark crimson pants that lightly dragged on the ground and hid his feet from view, while white tribal flames decorated the leggings from the cuffs up to his knees, a pure white rope tied around his waist for a belt with the 2 ends having been dyed blood red, white cloth wrapped around his hands and forearms that left only his clawed fingers uncovered, a pair of dark crimson Anbu-style bracers strapped to his forearms over the wrappings, with an additional plate covering the back of his hands, white cloth wrapped around his feet and ankles that left his toes and heels uncovered, dark crimson greaves strapped to his shins over the wrappings that included an armored plate that covered the tops of his feet, and a dark green 3-inch long hexagonal gem hanging from a black cord with a pair of large 4-inch long fangs flanking the crystal. Crossed behind his waist were a pair of short swords, made from what seemed like giant fangs or bones, that had been shaved and sharpened into dangerous weapons, with black leather wrapped around the foot-long handles, while the narrow and slightly curved blades were roughly 2.5 feet in length. The only thing he didn't like about himself was the fact he was so big, but at least it was better than being a scrawny midget, in his opinion. Are you sure there isn't another way? Naruto asked quietly, casting a mildly hesitant sidelong glance at his surrogate grandfather. Hiruzen could only smile and chuckle at the young man's reluctance. He couldn't blame him. Wordlessly, Hiruzen ushered him into the classroom, disappearing via Shunshin before Naruto could turn around. Growling quietly under his breath with a slight snarl, Naruto turned to face forward again, only to go silent and freeze in place, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of so many people being in one room. Uzumaki Naruto, correct? The scarred Chunin inquired, getting a slight nod from Naruto as he recompassed himself and looked at the man, who was a little unsettled by his eyes and overall appearance. General reaction. Nothing to worry about. The Chunin then smiled, introducing himself. I'm Yamino Iruka, but for the remainder of the day, please just call me Iruka-sensei. Now, if you'll please go have a seat, we'll get started with the Genin exams. Naruto was silent as he turned his gaze back to the rest of the classroom, searching for a spot that would prove beneficial and amiably comfortable, while idly noticing how they all looked a couple years younger than himself. Spotting a young Hyuga woman in the back that was blushing and looked away briskly when he looked in her direction, Naruto decided she would prove the least abrasive. Sitting down, Naruto forced a small smile on his face, deciding to politely introduce himself to her. "Hello, I'm Uzumaki Naruto. Hyuga Hinata. And nice to meet you," and Naruto-kun Hinata replied shyly, blushing even more furiously as she gazed down at the hands folded in her lap, fidgeting slightly. Glancing at the young woman, Naruto gave her a once-over, examining her more closely than he had while searching for a place to sit. Standing at an even 5 feet, 15-year-old Hyuga Hinata held a slender and lithe frame that was hidden beneath a pair of baggy and airy pants with slits in the sides at her hips, a black skin-tight backless and sleeveless top that did little to hide her impressive D-cup bust and slim waist, black skin-tight arm warmers that went from her wrists up to the middle of her biceps, a lavender-colored sash wrapped around her waist, a pair of black shinobi sandals on her feet, and a baggy lavender hoodie over her top with white sleeves and lavender cuffs. Her eyes were the usual pupil less wide as all Hyuga, but her gaze was soft and kind-hearted. Her skin was a pale cream color and unblemished, the smooth curtain of waist-length obsidian hair contrasting heavily with her complexion. He could only assume it was normal for her, but she had the hood pulled over her head with her hair pulled forward over her left shoulder, and her hands were hidden inside the cuffs of her sleeves, looking almost as if she just wanted to disappear into her jacket. Finding her to be quite beautiful, if not strangely shy, Naruto closed his eyes and adjusted his position, crossing his legs under him as he folded his hands in his lap with his knuckles pressed against each other. While not exactly meditating, it was simply something he did to relax. It also helped pass the time. The only bad thing was that he had to pay attention to how deep of a state he entered because of his powerful elemental affinities. If he reached a certain point, his elements would manifest around him and it had a high risk of injuring someone. Especially, his fire element. "Maki Naruto." Iruka called out, his voice cutting into Naruto's thoughts after what felt like seconds had passed. Slowly opening his eyes, Naruto looked up at the Chunin to find the man smiling at him once more. After the man motioned for Naruto to join him at the front of the class, Iruka cradled his clipboard in preparation to grade the Genin hopeful. "Alright, we'll be doing the ninjutsu portion, so if you don't mind, could you perform the Bunshin, Henge, and the Kawarimi, please?" "Page Bunshin." Naruto muttered quietly without forming a single hand seal, while 2 exact and solid copies of himself came into existence via clouds of smoke, all 3 simply standing there with their arms crossed over their chests. While Iruka was shocked, the Chunin had been warned of Naruto having excessively high amounts of chakra, keeping him from performing certain aspects unlike others his age. It's not like more advanced clone techniques weren't allowed. Even a couple of the students that were expected to pass knew at least one. That was when Naruto performed the henge without stating the name of the technique and making a hand seal, each of them changing into one of the 3 deceased Hokages of Konoha without leaving their previous stances, the Shadame, Nidame, and Yandame, all standing there with their arms crossed over their chests. Without a sound or hand seal, the clones dispelled their disguises before dispelling themselves a moment later, revealing Naruto to be on the left instead of in the middle like he had been earlier. "Excellent. Now, I've already been told you can't perform genjutsu, but it is required that you at least know how to detect and break out of one." Iruka stated before his assistant, another Chunin, stood up and went through a couple hand seals before Naruto felt the genjutsu take hold. It was a really basic one that simply robbed a person of their sense of smell. He honestly felt insulted by the pathetic illusion and snorted, expelling a wisp of black smoke. Instantly, the illusion was broken from him gathering a hint of chakra in his lungs to create the smoke, entirely out of habit, but it was enough to break the E-rank genjutsu. "Good, good. You can go sit back down now, Naruto-san." Rolling his eyes, Naruto walked back to his chosen spot beside Hinata and returned to his previous posture, but this time he kept his eyes open, glancing around the room lazily. He was honestly confused as to how someone could fail that test. It was truly pathetic, really. Naruto was sure he could pass it in his sleep. Cocking an eyebrow, he noticed several of the girls in the room giving him strange looks, while even more were giving the same looks towards a black-haired teen that Naruto suspected to be Uchiha Sasuke. The towering tattooed titan of Uzumaki snorted again, dismissing the sole surviving Uchiha as nothing more than an emotionally dysfunctional and mentally destabilized adolescent. There was nothing special about him, his bloodline, or his deceased kin. After glancing over the rest of the students in the room, Naruto found himself focusing back on the girl beside him, Hinata. Everything about her was a contradiction to the general personality of her clan. Where they were arrogant and stubborn in their ways, Hinata was shy and submissive. While other Hyuga had the same solid wide eyes, Hinata's were a soft and faint shade of lavender. Even the way she dressed was completely different. Albeit, still baggy, Hyuga normally preferred robe-like attire, while Hinata seemed to prefer something she could easily hide in. making a mental note to assist the poor girl with her obvious self-confidence issues. Should they be placed on the same team, Naruto sighed quietly and focused back on the front of the class. It was only a couple minutes before they were led outside to the academy's training ground set up behind the facility. Forced to stand, Naruto simply crossed his arms over his chest and waited for his name to be called for the taijutsu portion of the Genin exams. Much like the ninjutsu portion, they were being called alphabetically. This only annoyed Naruto, especially when he realized that none of the other students were all that skilled in taijutsu, with the only exception being a few of the clan heirs. A quiet yet rumbling growl formed in his chest and throat as he realized he would be stuck with a bunch of brats that couldn't do a damn thing. He just knew it was a bad idea. Why couldn't he have just left and become a wandering mercenary or something? It would have been so much simpler and more enjoyable. Uchiha Sasuke and Uzumaki Naruto. You're up. Iruka called out. Sighing heavily, Naruto pushed his way to the front of the crowd and stepped into the designated sparring circle drawn into the soil via white chalk powder. When Sasuke stepped in, Naruto winced at the volume of the rabid fangirls screaming. Damn banshees, Naruto snarled under his breath with a snort, causing another wisp of black smoke to escape his nostrils. Facing his opponent, Naruto waited for the Uchiha to enter his taijutsu stance before slipping into his own. Bending his legs at the knee and spreading his feet apart until they were a little more than shoulder width, Naruto kept his left side to Sasuke while bending his left arm, with his tensed and partially curled fingers held at his eye level, his right hand held similarly just above his right hip. Across from him, an arrogant smirk formed on Sasuke's face as he locked gazes with Naruto. The redhead's eyes narrowed with destructive anger as he remained stoic, his mouth parting slightly and letting twin streams of black smoke ooze out of the corners of his mouth. The damn brat was pissing him off. Hajime. Iruka called out. Sasuke didn't even have time to blink before Naruto made his move, digging his left foot into the ground while swinging his right foot around, purposefully dragging the claws of his right foot along the ground. Swinging the foot up as it came around in front of him, Naruto kicked some dirt into Sasuke's face, forcing the Uchiha to close his eyes and look away to avoid getting any in his eyes. While he was distracted, Naruto swiftly stomped his right foot back down before swinging his left foot up, catching Sasuke in the ribs on his right side with enough force to crack one and bend the Uchiha over his shin for a moment. Moving just as quick as before, Naruto swung his left foot back down while kicking off the ground, only to slam his right foot into Sasuke's left flank in the same manner, cracking another rib before the Uchiha was sent tumbling a few feet. Ah! Sasuke cried out in pain briefly, stumbling slightly as he got back up onto his feet while trying to ignore the pain in his sides. Glaring daggers at his red-haired opponent, Sasuke balled his hands up into fists once more and charged in for an attack. Without warning, Naruto took a single step forward and thrust his right fist into Sasuke's stomach once he was within range, doubling him over, only to retract his hand and bring his right knee up, bashing it into the Uchiha's face. As Sasuke was knocked back up into a standing position, Naruto, having cocked his right hand back again, slammed his right palm into Sasuke's chest, launching him back towards the edge of the ring. Shifting back into his beginning stance, Naruto snorted once more, exhaling yet another wisp of smoke. Scrambling to his feet, Sasuke glared at Naruto with enough hatred that the Slayer thought he was about to spontaneously combust into flames. It wouldn't do much, but it would be somewhat amusing if it actually happened. It was only a few seconds before Sasuke came at him again. You're going to pay for that. The Uchiha snarled as he attempted to kick Naruto in the head with a roundhouse with his left foot that was surprisingly swift but not quick enough to catch Naruto off guard. Instantly, he rose his right hand and blocked the kick with his forearm before lashing out with a powerful left jab that caught Sasuke in the jaw, knocking him back again. However, Naruto didn't let it stop there and stepped into Sasuke's guard while he was disoriented. Grabbing the slightly dazed Uchiha by the collar of his top, Naruto let a fanged grin spread across his face while leaning back. Ryu no Monshu. Naruto roared before suddenly headbutting Sasuke in the face, flooring the Uchiha and knocking him out in an instant while breaking his nose. As the victor was declared by Mizuki, Iruka came running over to check on Sasuke. Snorting out another breath of black smoke, Naruto crossed his arms and stepped back. The brat is fine. Too bad his pride is going to be scarred for the rest of his life. Mizuki. Keep an eye on the class while I take Sasuke to the nurse to make sure he's okay. Iruka ordered of the other Chunin before shunshining out of the area with Sasuke's unconscious form. Snorting more heavily than before, Naruto narrowed his eyes and walked back to where he had been earlier, only to have a tiny hand grab his arm to turn him around. He didn't even react as a second one became a fist and struck him across the cheek, but it barely even made his head move, let alone turn his head to the side. He hadn't even felt it. The other person, however, was cradling their most likely broken hand and glaring at him venomously. How dare you hurt Sasuke-kun like that? Who do you think you are? Ami, if he recalled right, screamed. Naruto simply stared at her coldly before wrapping his left hand around her face and lifting her off the ground, a slight snarl of anger forming on his face. Those around them could only watch with hesitance and slight fear as they watched the giant easily lift someone off the ground with a single hand by holding onto their face. That, and he had effortlessly and ruthlessly taken down Sasuke, the supposed rookie of the year, with only a handful of moves. I am Uzumaki Naruto and the last slayer alive. I will not tolerate your attempts to hurt me and insult me, nor will I tolerate those of any other. This time, I'll let it slide, but if you do that again, Naruto trailed off for a moment, squeezing a little harder, just enough to make the purple-haired girl cry out faintly, before tossing her back to cower away from him in terror. You will soon regret provoking me and meet a swift end shortly after. A sleeping dragon, much. Inyazuka Kiba teased with Akimichi Chouji. They immediately tensed up when Naruto glanced at them over his shoulder with a smirk, his eyes narrowed slightly with amusement. He liked the sound of that, a sleeping dragon. What better way to describe him than as such? Ignoring the others, Naruto returned to his spot at the back of the crowd, crossing his arms over his chest as he leaned back against a tree. His smirk became a slight frown, however, when he realized it wouldn't be much longer before he ascended, achieving the next level of his bloodline. He internally dreaded that day, knowing his life would only get more editing afterwards. Why do slayers have to keep evolving? Naruto mentally grumbled as he slouched slightly for a moment. A long and deep growl continued to rumble in Naruto's chest as he sat at the back of the class by himself, black smoke oozing from his nostrils as he glared at the far wall with his arms crossed over his chest, his Konoha hit IA tied around his left bicep on a strip of black cloth. He had been assigned to a team, but not just any team. No, it had to be that one. Team 7, under Hada Kakashi, consisted of himself, Uchiha Sasuke, and Hyuga Hinata. What angered him so much about the team assignment was the fact he had been placed with the Uchiha. That and their sensei was 2 hours late. He was just thankful that the purple-haired banshee from earlier had failed the Taijutsu portion and the accuracy test, resulting in her failure to graduate to Genin. Or fuck this. I'm going somewhere else. Naruto finally snarled as he stood up and moved to leave, only to have the door slide open and reveal the one-eyed Jounin that was to be their sensei. Clenching his jaw tight, Naruto glared into Kakashi's lone eye before snorting out a puff of onyx smog in the Jounin's face before stepping aside to let him in. You're late. I got lost on the road to life, Kakashi lied pitifully, succeeding only in making Naruto snort out another cloud of black smoke, while Hinata gained a slight frown on her face, with Sasuke simply glaring heatedly at Naruto, plotting his revenge against the redhead. Smiling at them, he motioned for his new students to follow him before leading them to the roof. Sasuke and Hinata sat down on the steps to the balcony, while Naruto leaned back against the railing of said balcony behind them, his arms crossed over his chest and eyes locked on the Jounin. Okay, let's begin with some introductions. I'll go first to start things off. I am Hada Kakashi and I have no real desire to tell you my likes and dislikes. Dreams for the future. Oh, and I have lots of hobbies. You're next, Smokey. My name is Uzumaki Naruto and I am the last living slayer of the Uzumaki clan. Naruto began with a growl and a glare at first, irritated by the nickname. His mentioning of being a slayer confused Hinata slightly, didn't faze Sasuke, and made Kakashi's lone eye widen slightly in surprise. I like fire, caves, and meat. I dislike arrogance, ignorance, stupidity in general, cowardice, and I will not tolerate the mistreatment of females. My dream is personal and I refuse to share it. As for my hobbies, training and sleeping. I didn't think sleeping could be considered a hobby, but okay, you're up, wide eyes. Kakashi remarked, making Hinata seemingly sink further into her jacket at the apparent moniker she had earned herself due to her clan's eyes and Taijutsu. I'm Hyuga Hinata. The dark-haired young woman responded, her voice soft-spoken and timid with a slight stutter, but it did catch more of Naruto's attention. He narrowed his eyes slightly, wondering what had happened to make her so nervous and submissive, before silently vowing to do whatever he had to in order to fix that problem. I like G gardening and F flowers. I don't like bubilies, fighting, or needless violence. My hobbies are making different medicines using the herbs I grow in my garden. My dream is to one day unite the M main and B branch houses of the Hyuga clan and abolish the Kasage bird seal. Your turn, sunshine. Kakashi stated calmly. Completely disregarding what the Uchiha had to say, Naruto focused his attention on a lizard that was on the railing beside him. It was an unusual one that Naruto found quite interesting due to its coloration. Its body was a turquoise blue with dark maroon stripes running horizontally across its back, with a dark maroon ring on top of its head that had a small dark maroon dot in the center of it, its underbelly being a beigeish color, while its eyes were a unique red-orange with black vertically slit pupils. Slowly lowering his hand down to the railing, Naruto was kind of intrigued when it fearlessly crawled into his palm. Lifting it up so that it was eye level with him, he maintained his blank look of disinterest as he entered a staring contest of sorts with the gecko up until he heard someone laugh about something, making Naruto jump slightly and blush ever so faintly, but it was hard to tell due to the red markings on his face. What did I miss? Naruto mumbled as he glanced over at Kakashi, who was smiling at him and chuckling still. That was when Naruto realized that they were the only ones there. You've been staring at that lizard for more than 10 minutes now. The others have already left. He commented, making Naruto sigh heavily before gently setting the gecko back down on the railing and turning to leave while stuffing his hands in his pockets. Before he got too far, Kakashi called out to him while lazily walking after him. I was wondering if you'd answer a few questions for me. Would you mind? You're a lazy fool with no sense of time, but fine. Ask your questions. Naruto remarked, regaining his rather cold and somewhat cruel demeanor as he stopped and turned to Kakashi, crossing his arms over his chest. Earlier, you mentioned you were a slayer. I once knew an Uzumaki, and she mentioned that name once before. Would you mind explaining what a slayer is? The Jounin inquired, making Naruto sigh, knowing that Kakashi was talking about his mother. Not wanting to be overheard by anyone that might be listening in on their conversation, Naruto suddenly grabbed Kakashi by his flak vest before using a shunshin that surrounded them in a swirling vortex of fire that died out a moment later. Reappearing outside of the entrance to his cave, Naruto released the man in motion for him to follow. What are we doing here? I don't want others hearing what I'm undoubtedly going to end up telling you. I may mention that I'm a slayer rather openly, but I like to keep the details a secret from other people. Naruto responded as he led the Jounin down the dark tunnel that had only a few torches scattered along the wall down its length, leaving large pockets of shadow. After a couple minutes, they eventually reached a large open chamber. Kakashi could only stare on in amazement, finding it to be a hidden paradise of sorts. Taking up most, if not all, of the chamber was a large, natural pool of cool crystal clear water that was easily 200 meters in diameter, with a circular opening in the ceiling directly over it, almost 100 feet above that was only about 75 meters across. Sitting in the center of the pool was a 50-meter wide island of smooth stone, with a narrow path of smooth river rocks, leading from the shore in front of the tunnel to the island, and from the back of the island to the other side of the lake. Two steel posts stuck out of the rock at one side, with a large hammock hanging from them, while what appeared to be an anvil, a hammer, a pile of unshaped metal, and a pile of random metal objects sat off at the other end of the island. Hanging from the edge of the hole above the island were innumerable leafy vines that nearly reached all the way down to the water, creating a privacy curtain of sorts around the island, while even more vines stretched out across the hole to the other side, creating a natural screen of shade that kept the lighting at a comfortable level. Kakashi noticed another tunnel at the back of the chamber, but he couldn't see anything beyond that due to the black bear fur veiling the opening. He could only assume it was Naruto's bedroom or something. Come. Sit. Naruto offered as he took a seat on a large, smooth rock at the edge of the water, with his legs crossed under him and his hands folded in his lap, his knuckles pressed together, just as he had been sitting while back in the classroom. Kakashi sat down on a second rock that was a couple feet away from the one Naruto was sitting on. You asked what a slayer was, correct? A slayer is an Uzumaki that has awakened a very ancient and powerful bloodline that had once been thought lost to us. It had become so rare that the last slayer to awaken their Kirinketsu before me died almost 50 years before the Shodaime founded Konoha with the Uchiha clan. As of now, I am both the last known living Uzumaki and the only slayer left, but a strange anomaly about me is that my slayer blood is much more potent than what it normal should be due to my ancestry and lineage. I see. However, it doesn't exactly answer my question fully. What is this bloodline you speak of? What makes it as powerful as you say it is? Kakashi inquired, but he figured he already knew the answer after glancing over Naruto's tattoos and seeing him breathe smoke several times already. The bloodline is called Kirinketsu and it has multiple stages. The first is the awakened stage, which is actually where I am right now, but I'll soon be achieving the next stage, which is the ascended stage. When a slayer activates their Kirinketsu, they are considered awakened slayers and develop the same markings that I myself bear, but at a progressive rate, showing how far they are in their training and how close they are to reaching the ascended stage. They also gain a very powerful fire affinity alongside their natural element or elements, which are earth and water for me. Naruto explained, turning his eyes over to the still mirror-like surface of the water beside him. Like I just said, the ascended stage is the next level. When a slayer reaches that stage, they will sometimes grow a pair of horns on their head and always start to develop armor-like scales on their body. Some have even been reported to grow a tail, but that was a rare trait even when slayers were common. Anyway, the third stage is that of the adult stage, which is mostly just a medium between the ascended stage and the final level, the elder stage. In the adult stage, the Slayer's scales will grow denser and thicker, along with spreading a little more, while their abilities will be boosted, such as a faster healing factor, hotter flames, greater physical strength, and the like. Adult stage Slayers will also always grow horns if they didn't have them already, alongside gaining another boost in their abilities and their scales spreading a bit more. In the last stage, the Elder stage, the Slayer's scales will spread to a couple more places on their body, their horns will grow more prominent, and Elders have been reported to grow wings that actually gave them the capability to fly, but very few Slayers ever lived long enough to reach that stage, mostly due to the wars, the clan wars, to be specific. While everything isn't quite that simple, I'm sure you understand that I can't simply reveal everything about my bloodline to you, seeing as you are not one of my clan, nor is there a proper reason for me to explain everything to you. No, that's alright. Kakashi, despite the response, was rendered speechless for a few moments by the knowledge, his lone visible eye wide with surprise. If you don't mind me asking, just what can a Slayer do? As I mentioned earlier, we have very powerful elemental affinities. One is always fire. The other element or elements vary depending on the person. These powerful affinities allow Slayers to utilize raw elemental chakra manipulation in combat instead of having to rely on ninjutsu. An example of which is one of the most basic abilities a Slayer has, it is the ability to actually breathe fire and not in the form of a Genin technique. Naruto explained, and just to ensure Kakashi got the point, Naruto turned his head to the side before taking a deep breath and exhaling, breathing out a stream of white hot flame that made Kakashi recoil slightly due to the searing heat that accosted him from several feet away. Stopping and facing Kakashi once more as black smoke leaked out from his mouth, Naruto lazily waved his hand to clear the smog from in front of his face. We are also gifted with great physical strength that allows us to crush even diamonds in our fists during the later stages of our bloodline's evolutionary cycle. We have powerful natural healing abilities that grow stronger as our Kirinketsu awakens further, a longer lifespan than what is considered normal due to our originating Uzumaki lineage, and we're very agile, but the level of such usually depends upon the Slayer's build like it normally would for anyone else. Other than that, most of what we can do is limited by our will and what we learn from the clan scrolls. However, I am quite sure you already know, but I am not just a Slayer. You mean the Kyuubi, right? Kakashi inquired seriously, getting a nod from Naruto. Yes. On the night of my birth, it attacked Konoha and was sealed into me by the Yondaime, your sensei, might I add. Naruto began while locking gazes with the Cyclopean Jounin. Anyway, I figured I would warn you of that because I do not know how I will behave while progressing to the ascended stage. I might go into a berserker rage if the Kyuubi acts up. For now, that's all I will tell you. Alright. Thank you for your time. Oh, and don't forget to come to training ground 13 by sunrise tomorrow morning. Kakashi responded before standing up and walking away, heading down the tunnel towards the exit. Watching the man leave, Naruto sighed quietly before standing and stretching. Barback sounds good right about now, Naruto mumbled to himself as he stood up, scratching under his chin as he made to leave his humble abode in search of dinner. Kakashi was far from weak. He had made Jounin at the age of 13. He was among the strongest of Jounin in Konoha. He had been trained by the Yondaime Hokage himself. He had a Sharingan for a left eye. He had participated in and survived the Third Great War. He had been an Anbu captain. He had copied 1,000 techniques. So why was he getting thrashed so badly by one of his prospective students? One that was self-taught, at that. Ah. The wind was forcefully evicted from Kakashi's lungs as a large tattooed fist buried itself in his gut with the strength to lift him several inches off the ground, only to be retracted while the other came down and slammed into his upper back, smashing the Jounin down into the ground. Or rather, he would have been had he not used Kawarimi to replace himself with a log at the last second. Staring down at the crushed remnants of splintered and mulched wood that his right fist still sat in, Naruto snorted out another puff of black smoke before standing up straight again and dusting his hands off. Odd, that kid's a Taijutsu monster. Worse than Guy was at that age. Kakashi mentally cried as he remained hidden amongst the branches of a tree, still holding his stomach in agony. He was pretty sure he had at least 3 cracked bones in his body, if not more, and that last blow he took to his stomach felt like he was just hit with an Oni's club. Sighing heavily as the pain started fading away slightly, Kakashi leaned his head back against the tree trunk. This just isn't my day, is it? Not only that, but after being backed into a corner at one point and forced to use a low-level Kaiten technique, Kakashi had discovered a rather startling fact about his student: he was fireproof, a side effect of having such a high fire affinity. Naruto's skin was also far denser than normal due to his abnormally high earth affinity, making things even more difficult when it came to trying to cut him with a simple kunai when in close quarters. Well-thrown kunai and shuriken just didn't have the penetrating power to do little more than scratch and poke him, drawing only a few drops of blood at best. On top of all of this, Naruto was shockingly quick for someone of his size and had ungodly strength that, if Kakashi didn't know any better, the Jounin would have sworn Naruto had been taught by Tsunade. "This is getting boring," Naruto muttered to himself. Smirking faintly to himself, he found it entertaining how Kakashi had yet to realize that the red-head had stolen the bells from the man not long after engaging him into jutsu. What annoyed him, however, was the apparent purpose for Kakashi's little test. The man wanted them to work together, but Naruto knew that it was virtually impossible to work with the Uchiha brat, and he didn't even know the brat. He knew the team was doomed from the start, but that didn't mean Naruto was going to sit back and get sent back to the academy, which he would undoubtedly be forced to attend by the Sandaime, until he was placed on another team. Creating a cage bunshin, Naruto watched as it grinned fiendishly before leaping into the tree line. A moment later, a loud crash was heard before a tree started falling over, only for Kakashi to flee the forest in an attempt to put distance between himself and Naruto's clone. That should keep him busy for now. Naruto mumbled before creating 2 more cage bunshin and passing a bell to either of them. Locate the other 2 and give them a bell. Hinata should be rather easy to deal with, but if Sasuke starts getting out of hand, just knock him out and leave the bell in his pocket or something. Hi. Both of his clones responded before taking off in search of their targets. Heading off to where his clone had chased after Kakashi, Naruto let a fanged grin split his face as he grabbed the leather-bound handles of his rather primitive-looking weapons without drawing them just yet. Humming to a stop on a thick branch in a crouch with his hand still resting on the handles of his swords, Naruto's grin grew a bit more as he watched his clone continue to simply smash through every guard Kakashi threw up in order to protect himself. It was obvious that he was better into jutsu, but Naruto was curious as to whether Kakashi was any good at kinjutsu. Well, let's find out. The redhead mumbled to himself as he leapt from the branch, just as Kakashi managed to dispel his clone with a well-placed rabbit punch to the neck, drawing his bone-like swords as he descended upon the man with a fanged grin. "It seems like Kakashi is late once again," the Sandaime Hokage grumbled quietly as the other Jounin that had taken up teams stood before him, along with a few others that simply wanted to attend. The next moment, however, the door opened and a very exhausted Kakashi stumbled into the room, his singed clothes still smoking with small rips and tears throughout it, his lone visible eye wide and unfocused, a few scratches dotting his limbs. He was covered in more than enough bruises for an entire group, he looked rather well concussed, and he was missing his left sandal for some reason. While the crowd of Jounin instantly broke out into mutterings and whispers, Hiruzen took one look at Kakashi and sighed. "I take it they passed." "Ye coffee team 7 passes." Kakashi managed to get out, literally coughing up a bit of smoke as he sunk into one of the few chairs in the room. Walking over to the dazed Jounin, Anko, with a look of unconvinced confusion, licked the tip of her index finger and thumb before putting out the small flame burning at the end of a few of Kakashi's hairs. "So, you're saying a couple of Genin did this to you? Impossible." The 24-year-old purple-haired Takebetsu Jounin inquired and then stated, but her look of confusion intensified when Kakashi shook his head, only for her eyes to go wide with shock, along with those of the others present, when Kakashi spoke up again. "Not a team, just one great big," Broody corrected a bit absently and vaguely, obviously still suffering from a rather hard blow to the head, making Hiruzen smirk slightly while Anko and everyone else in the room looked to him for an explanation. Thus, the Sandaime sighed once more. "He's talking about one Uzumaki Naruto, a newly graduated genin that possesses a bloodline that not even the councils would dare to mess with." While he was absolutely serious about what he just said, Hiruzen couldn't help chuckling at the looks of shock and the whispered disbeliefs from the assembled Jounin. Well, at least the ones currently capable of coherent thought. That's when the Kunoichi he saw as a granddaughter decided to open her mouth. "Bullshit. There is no way a fresh out of the academy genin could do this." Anko paused for effect as she jabbed a finger at the still stupefied Kakashi. To a veteran Jounin. Especially one of Kakashi's caliber. "Enka's a slayer. You remember what a slayer is, don't you?" Hiruzen stated calmly and patiently as if he were talking to a child. Anko blinked for a moment as she recalled everything the Sandaime had ever taught her about bloodlines, focusing on the word slayer. A moment later, she gained a sheepish look and blushed slightly, scratching the back of her neck as she turned her gaze down to the floor. The Hokage merely stared at her for a moment and sighed. "You forgot, didn't you?" I did," Anko answered timidly, looking much like a scolded child at the moment. Once again, Hiruzen sighed, but this time out of exasperation. How was it possible for a grown woman to go from being one of the most talented and, in his opinion, one of the scariest females in Konoha one moment to being so childlike and innocent and mature the next? "Come see me in my office after the meeting. I'll explain it to you there," the Sandaime stated before shuffling some of the papers on his desk and looking up at the gathered Jounin in the room. "Now, on with the meeting. Team 1. Failed. Wait. So, this kid has dragon blood running through his veins, Anko practically yelled out in shock, drawing a chuckle from Hiruzen, while Kakashi, having recompassed himself and changed into a set of fresh clothes, merely cited a reaction. That's just its name, Anko, and while his bloodline does share a number of similarities with dragons, there is still no solid evidence that suggests it is actual dragon blood flowing through his body. Kakashi remarked, this time getting another chuckle from the Sandaime, along with a knowing smirk from the elderly man. Kakashi narrowed his eye with a deadpan expression. Anko was right, wasn't she? Yes, she was. Hiruzen answered while Anko looked like she was just given a lifetime supply of dango. Woo. In your face, Kakashi Baka. Anko howled with a shit-eating grin as she pumped her fists into the air excitably. Sighing yet again, Hiruzen rubbed his temples, dreading the day Anko and Naruto met. An overexcitable woman with an addiction to scaring people, sharp and/or pointy objects, a strange attraction to blood, and prankster-esque tendencies paired up with a dragon-like juggernaut capable of breathing fire, a very short fuse and anger management problems when it comes to his temper, has a habit of solving problems by setting them on fire, a very vindictive side, and is also a secret master closet prankster. Konoha would cease to exist if those two became friends. Now, as I was say Sarutobi Hiruzen was interrupted as Anko ran for the door. See you later, old man. I've got a dragon dude to track down. Was all she yelled over her shoulder before slamming the door shut behind her. As the blood drained from his face, Hiruzen slouched in his comfy chair and stared at the door blankly. The Sandaime's next words would forever haunt Kakashi from then on after questioning the Hokage as to why he said them. We're all doomed. Chapter 2. Mon, I knew I should have asked for a description of the kid before I ran off, Anko whined to herself as she slouched, still walking along the road, just as she had been for the past few hours. I should have asked for at least one little clue about him. At least it would have narrowed down my search. What the fuck do you mean you don't serve my kind here? Someone bellowed from a nearby shop, drawing Anko's attention. Walking up to the shinobi weapons store and slipping inside unnoticed, Anko caught sight of a giant red-haired man covered in strange tattoos, holding the store clerk by the collar of his shirt after reaching across the counter and pulling him across it to the redhead side, still holding the smaller man by the collar of his shirt with his left hand while said store clerk's feet dangled a few inches off the ground. What? Just because I don't look like you, I'm instantly some kind of demon, you motherfucker. I came here to spend my money at your store and you're complaining. Just how stupid can you get? Holy shitey, don't know whether to be turned on by this dude or worried for the little guy, Anko thought to herself, her eyes wide with shock, before watching as the redhead closed his eyes and took a deep breath to calm down, snorting out a puff of black smoke as he raised the store clerk back over the counter and calmly set him down. Letting the shaking and scared shitless man go, he stepped back and held his hands up for a moment, taking another deep breath while simultaneously exhaling a cloud of dark smog as he restrained the urge to burn down the store and cremate the idiot in front of him. You know what? You're just like everyone else, looking down on me just because I don't look normal. You're not even worth my time, asshole. The redhead growled out before turning around and heading towards the door, his black and red eyes momentarily locking with Anko's brown as he passed by her before looking forward again, actually ripping the door off its hinges on his way out just to relieve a bit of anger and letting it lie in the middle of the street as he left. Now curious and suspicious of the man that might just be her original target of interest, Anko left the store and jumped to the nearest roof, following the redhead from higher ground and a fair distance from him to reduce the chance of being detected. Easy, feel kind of bad for the guy being ostracized just because he doesn't look like everyone else. Anko mused to herself, noticing how the people in the streets were parting to give the redhead a wide berth, not wanting to be near him. Thinking back on what little she had actually been told about the Slayer, Anko recalled that he hadn't actually been in the village since he was 7 when his bloodline awoke and had returned only a year ago, but didn't go out much, if at all, and didn't really have any friends. He hadn't even joined the academy until just the other day, and that was only so he could take the Genin exam. From what the Hokage had said, he apparently liked the isolation, since most people were either afraid of him or hated him because of his appearance, many referring to him as a demon, freak, or monster. Anko couldn't stop the frown from forming at the thought or the look of sadness and understanding from showing in her eyes, having been treated similarly due to her past. I see you found him. Someone stated from behind her, scaring the shit out of her, and through willpower alone, Anko stopped herself from screaming while slapping her hands over her mouth. Spinning around and glaring at the person, Kakashi, Anko swore to get him back for that later. Damn it, Kakashi. Don't sneak up on me like that. Anko hissed quietly before turning back around to keep an eye on her prey, moving from the rooftop she was on into another in order to keep the unknown redhead in her sights, with Kakashi following her. After a few moments of silence, Anko's mood became somber once more. Kakashi, was his life always like that? Unfortunately, yes. The silver-haired Jounin stated quietly while putting his Icha book away, watching as Naruto snarled rabidly at a civilian that had decided to openly call the red-headed demon and told him to go back to hell, where he belonged, but the Genin otherwise ignored him. Without openly telling Anko Naruto's identity, Kakashi decided to drop clues in his explanation of the teen's life, wanting her to figure it out on her own. When he was younger, his life was far harder than what it is now, but that's only because people don't recognize him anymore. At the age of 3, he had been kicked out of the orphanage and was forced to live on the streets. Almost every couple days after that, he would be beaten by drunk civilians. He was sold expired and sometimes poisoned food if they even sold him anything at all. The clothes he had were riddled with holes and dirty, since he had to salvage them from trash cans and dumpsters, and every year, he would be hunted by mobs during the annual Kitsune festival. Wait, him, too. I thought the only kid hunted around that time of year was Anko. Trailed off as she started adding things together, recalling that the Sandame had mentioned Naruto's name back at the meeting. Her eyes widened and she looked back towards the redhead. Naruto. But that's not possible. Naruto had blonde hair and blue eyes when he disappeared, not red hair and red eyes. That's because of his bloodline. Actually, almost everything you see about him was caused by his bloodline, including his height, change in hair and eye color, and the tattoos. Kakashi informed as they changed positions once more, both following as Naruto made his way closer and closer to the forest. From what they had seen so far, the only people that didn't see or treat Naruto as a monster were those from the shinobi clans, whether they themselves were ninja or not. Both shinobi dreaded the day people discovered that Naruto was the container of the Kyuubi no Kitsune. The only good thing Kakashi saw that came out of it was the fact Naruto already lived out in the middle of nowhere, making it damn near impossible for them to find him, and his home was a cave, meaning it couldn't be burned down or anything. It still didn't help outweigh the cons of such a revelation. As they continued to follow the redhead in silence, Anko couldn't help thinking back to when she was younger and had come across a group of Konoha shinobi attacking a 7-year-old Naruto on the night he disappeared. Having only been about mid-Chunin in skill and strength back then while also being newly promoted to Chunin, Anko had been engaged by 3 veteran Chunin that kept her from getting to and protecting Naruto, while several others continued to beat the boy. It wasn't long before she had been knocked out by one of the Chunin, only to wake up the next day and discover that Naruto was gone. Unable to forgive herself for that night, Anko had gone into a mild depression before she eventually joined the torture and interrogation division, becoming one of the best they had and progressing in rank as she strove to drown out that part of her past. Now, 10 years later, Anko wasn't sure if Naruto even knew she existed, let alone if he knew she had tried to save him that night. Anko? Kakashi asked quietly, noticing how Anko's hands had balled up into fists with her nails digging into her palms. Snapping out of her thoughts, Anko turned her head and looked at the one-eyed Jounin, oblivious to the fact her eyes were a little misty with tears that had been wanting to fall. Are you alright? Anko stayed quiet for several minutes as she looked back towards Naruto and noticed that they had reached the forest. Using the sleeve of her trench coat, she quickly dried her eyes and took a deep breath to calm back down. The only people she would let her emotional mask slip around were Kakashi, Kurenai, the Sandame, and her friend Yugao. Kakashi, having been in Anbu at the time, had arrived to the scene on the night Naruto disappeared, just moments after Anko had been knocked out, saving not only her, but Naruto as well. Because of that, he had her respect, and despite the fact he was always reading his perverted Icha novels, Kakashi was also one of the few that respected her as a kunoichi and a woman, instead of just a piece of ass, or simply treated her like shit due to her past like most other men did. Can I have some time alone with him, Kakashi? I want to talk to him. Alright, but be careful. Naruto's temper isn't something to underestimate, nor is his strength. If he gets angry, I highly suggest you run before you get hurt and trust me, you'll know when he gets angry. Kakashi advised the younger woman before disappearing in a whirlwind of leaves. Although a bit unsettled by the warning, Anko was undeterred and made to approach Naruto, only to be a bit late as he had vanished into a tunnel at the base of a cliff. While she found his choice of residence a bit creepy and weird, Anko took another moment to recompose herself before following after Naruto into the tunnel. Same fucking thing everywhere, I got bunch of fucking hypocritical bastards, and the old man wonders why I don't like going into the village, Naruto grumbled quietly to himself as he pushed aside the bare fur covering the entrance to his home. Seeing as the underground lake and island were more like his front yard, the main chamber was more of a den, with 3 extra chambers attached to it that made up his bedroom to the left with a bathroom, a kitchen and dining room in the back to the right, a currently unused and unfurnished guest room of sorts, set up in the back on the left with a bathroom of its own, and his study library to the right. It had taken quite a bit of work and some troubleshooting when he first moved in, but his place had running water and electricity. However, his furniture was all handmade by himself, most of it being nothing more than animal furs sewn together and stuffed to form large cushions, having never liked regular furniture to begin with. Not only that, but his pending advancements in his Kirinketsu would make things difficult if he were to grow a tail when he progressed to the ascended stage or even wings when he advanced to the elder stage, if he was even still living in the cave by that point in time, that is. Going to his bedroom, which had a massive and thick black wool fur cushion sitting off to the back left corner of the chamber that was twice as big as a king-size mattress with numerous wool fur pillows of varying shades of grey and white piled on it, Naruto walked over to his dresser, which he had taken a great deal of care into crafting out of red oak with intricate tribal dragon designs carved into the wood all over it. The wood was stained for added color and depth in the natural designs in the wood, while a clear coat lacquer gave it a proper shine and a bit of protection against any minor cosmetic damages. Taking his bracers and greaves off, he set them down on top of the dresser before taking off the wrappings around his forearms and shins, taking a moment to neatly roll them up and set them aside on the dresser before pulling his bone swords free of his belt and setting them down on the stand on top of his dresser, something he had crafted for them out of cedar and stained to be a darker color with a polished surface just like his dresser. Wanting to take a nap out on his little island before starting dinner later, Naruto stepped back out of his home and was greeted with the sight of another person currently inhabiting his property and staring at his haven with wonder and amazement, idly recalling that the woman was the same one he had seen back in the store he had been in earlier. She stood at about 5'6" with a build caught between being slim and athletic while also being curvy and alluring at the same time, mildly tanned skin, light brown eyes, and dark purple hair that seemed to be a bit longer than shoulder length while being kept up in a tight and messy ponytail that looked not unlike the tail feathers of a peacock in his opinion. She was currently clad in a form-fitting short-sleeve fishnet top that did virtually nothing towards concealing her C-cup breasts, narrow waist, broad hips, and shapely legs, while a tan brown short skirt hung from around her hips over a pair of fishnet shorts with a black belt holding the skirt in place that also crossed over the top of her left hip. Over the fishnets, she wore a light tan knee-length long-sleeve trench coat with her Konoha hit IA tied around her head on a strip of blue cloth, her shins covered with wide Anbu-style greaves, and dark blue sandals on her feet. You've got 5 seconds to explain who you are and why you're trespassing on private property. Naruto suddenly spoke up with a slight growl to his voice and a scowl, the woman jumping slightly in startlement, having not noticed his presence. I'm Mitarashi Anko. I don't know if you remember me, but Anko trailed off a moment later in a rare and unseen moment where her usual self-confidence and bravado wavered. A moment later, however, she regained her determination and continued. I tried to save you from being attacked by some Chunin 10 years ago. So what? You want a medal or something? Naruto growled out sarcastically with annoyance, something that made Anko's blood boil before she forced herself to calm down. She knew it was just a self-defense mechanism, having one similar to it herself. His, though, just seemed to be able to get under her skin a whole lot quicker than her own. Look Anko, was it? It happened 10 years ago, get over it. It's not like anything could be done about it now, and to be completely honest, if I knew then what I know now, I would have told you to fuck off because my bloodline wouldn't have awoken otherwise. Anko growled quietly, finally losing her cool and marching up to the giant that tried to turn around and head back inside, only to grab his arm and turn him back around, glaring up at him as she stood no more than only a few inches away from him while restraining herself from simply punching him in the face. I was going to try and see if you wanted to be friends, asshole, but you're nothing more than an ungrateful bastard that doesn't know when someone is trying to be nice to him, even if that kindness came up and bit him in the ass. Naruto stayed quiet as he stared down at her with a blank expression while Anko started to calm back down, only to realize just exactly what she had said and suddenly wanted to do nothing more than to either shrink into herself or be as far away from the redhead as possible. That was when he reacted in a way she most certainly had not expected, he started laughing. It wasn't exactly a cruel laugh or even a genuinely happy laugh, it was more of a humorless, sarcastic laugh one would let out after discovering some sort of ironic truth. After a few moments, he finally started to quiet down and wiped an imaginary tear from his eye before giving Anko a fanged grin that made her a bit nervous. That was a good one. That's the first time anyone's had the balls to stand up to me like that and I've got to say you kinda like it. Huh? Anko mumbled quietly in confusion and shock, Naruto's reaction having thrown her for a loop and promptly ceased all of her higher brain functions. As Naruto walked around her and started heading towards his island, Anko was slowly regaining the ability to think, gradually coming to realize after a few seconds that Naruto had been testing her will and constitution. In simpler words, he was wondering if she'd just roll over and submit or stand her ground and strike back. What she didn't realize, however, was that Naruto was actually telling the truth when it came to the night his bloodline awoke. Snapping back into focus, Anko spun around and jogged to catch up to Naruto just as he reached the curtain of vines, using his hand to gently part the natural screen so he could enter his actual sanctuary, even going so far as to politely hold the vines to the side so that Anko could follow behind him. Looking around, Anko found herself lost in the natural beauty of the environment once more. What is this place? I found this cave when I came back to Konoha last year. Since then, I carved a few rooms out of the rock in the back to make an actual home for myself. Well, this here is my personal safe haven, my happy place, as it were. Naruto explained while walking over to his hammock and lying down in it, relaxing with his hands clasped together behind his head while he stared up at the tapestry of vines closing off the hole above them. A little surprised by the redhead's response, Anko leaned against a pole at the end of the hammock Naruto's feet were at. Did you know that you're the first person that I've actually allowed to set foot on this little island since I found this place? Why am I so special? Anko asked while looking away in order to hide the faint blush on her cheeks, but she couldn't figure out why she was so affected by what he said. Without moving from his spot, Naruto casually shrugged as best as he could in his current position. I don't know. I guess it's because you're the first person to actually stand up to me like that, the old man doesn't count. Naruto responded offhandedly, but Anko could tell he was being truthful. What he didn't tell her, though, was that it was mostly because she wanted to be his friend. People are usually intimidated by my size or my attitude and, thus, tend to back off a lot instead of continuing to argue or fight, especially after they find out just how strong I am. Because of that, I guess it's just sort of refreshing whenever someone stands up to me. It keeps me level, you know. Really, I only respect strength now and cowards just piss me off. You're not like I thought you would be. Anko spoke up after a few moments of silence, her statement getting a cocked eyebrow from Naruto as he glanced over at her. Granted, it's been 10 years since I last saw you and I didn't really know you back then to begin with, but I thought you would be like you used to be, all energetic and full of life, always cracking jokes and pulling pranks. You would always yell at the top of your lungs that you'd be the Hokage one day, too. HMPH. Naruto snorted, causing a small wisp of black smoke to escape his nostrils as he turned his gaze back to the ceiling of plant life. As he did, his eyes became a little unfocused and cold, his tone growing a bit emotionless as Anko turned her head to look back at him. So it fooled you, too, huh? Not surprising. Not even the old man could see through my mask back then. The reality of it all was that, back then, I would actually cry myself to sleep at night prior to the night my Kirinketsu activated. My mind was so fucked up around that time that I was actually starting to look forward to the beatings, simply because it meant that I still existed, that I was being acknowledged by other living beings. Outside of the beatings, most people would just ignore me, with the exception of the occasional curse or thrown rock or glass bottle. Apart from the old man, barely anyone cared about me back then. Don't know what to say, Anko admitted quietly, bowing her head with a hint of guilt, only to get lightly kicked in the back of her head. Glaring up at Naruto, Anko was caught off guard a little when Naruto glared right back at her even more intensely while pulling something out from under him. Snorting and causing another puff of smoke to escape his nostrils, Naruto fiddled with the bamboo pan flute in his hand, having forgotten that he had left it in his hammock yesterday. It was a simple one made up of 9 pipes of varying lengths, but it was painted snow white with red tribal dragons coiled around the length of each pipe, with the ends delicately carved into the shape of the gaping jaws of each dragon. Thanks to a couple hidden seals he had placed on it, Naruto didn't have to worry about the fragile fangs in the dragon mouths breaking or anything. He had even made sure to make it fireproof, along with most of his other belongings and clothes. Most people said he had an unhealthy obsession with dragons, but Naruto was just proud of who and what he was along with being proud of his heritage and ancestors. Then don't say anything at all. Naruto mumbled as Anko pouted childishly and looked away, while the redhead brought his pan flute to his lips after a moment of thought. Anko's eyes widened slightly when she heard music and glanced back at Naruto to find him playing his instrument, his eyes closed as he played a song of his own creation. Closing her eyes and letting the sounds wash over her, Anko couldn't help smiling slightly as a pleasant warmth filled her. Cracking his eye open after a few minutes, Naruto resisted the urge to smirk, lest he mess up as a thought popped into his head. Wanting to play a bit of a prank on the woman, which would undoubtedly result in him getting his ass kicked, Naruto channeled a bit of chakra into his lungs and infused it with the air in them, while also channeling a bit into the flute itself. Using the only genjutsu technique he knew that he had developed himself and simply called Kirin no Yuta, what made it special was that he could manipulate it at any time to cause any kind of reaction in a person that he wanted instead of creating illusions. In this case, he was going to mess with Anko a bit and give her something to remember him by for the rest of time. Anko stayed silent as the warmth she felt grew a bit more intense as her heart started racing for no reason at all, while the song gradually changed from calm and peaceful to something more lively, the chakra-infused sound waves resonating off the cave walls and growing stronger because of it. Gently biting her bottom lip as a fire began to build up in her core, Anko tried her best to fight off the new, unexpected and unbidden sensations, filling her senses as her cheeks flushed a deep red, but it was a fight she was quickly losing as a thin sheet of sweat formed on her skin. Squeezing her eyes shut and turning away from Naruto's direction without making it seem obvious, Anko tried her best to regain control of herself, but it wasn't working, the unbridled feeling of sensual pleasure and carnal hunger only growing stronger as the song's tempo continued to increase in speed. Barely holding back an impish grin as well as containing the urge to laugh his ass off, Naruto kept playing the song, still watching Anko as he kept his right eye closed. He could tell she was near her limit and that only made it all that much harder to keep from laughing for what he was about to do to her. Steadying the tempo out and switching the notes up, Naruto watched as Anko cringed slightly, barely managing to stay standing and having an even harder time with trying not to moan or whimper. Biting down on her bottom lip even harder than before, Anko gripped the waistband of her skirt with her left hand as tight as possible, while her right elbow was braced against the pole beside her in an attempt to look like she was standing in a more relaxed and casual pose. It was getting so damn hard to ignore now, her body betraying her mind as she struggled futilely to restrain herself, as she was almost on the verge of experiencing what she felt to be the most torturous and powerful orgasm she would have in her entire life, and she wasn't even having sex. Hell, she was still a virgin. Wow, what the hell is going on? Why am I behaving like this? This shouldn't be happening. Anko mentally cried out in frustration, desperation, and confusion as the music continued to fill her ears. As the melody began to reach a crescendo, Anko braced herself for what was about to happen, only for the music to suddenly go silent, leaving her wanting for more and without satisfaction. Unable to stand it any longer, Anko sunk to her knees while hanging her head, whining pitifully while Naruto's deep booming laugh sounded off from behind her. Gritting her teeth with anger fueled by sexual frustration, Anko realized that Naruto had just been using a sound-based ninjutsu on her. Seeing only red at that moment, Anko slowly forced herself to stand on shaky legs while walking over to stand beside Naruto's hammock. Without warning, she grabbed the edges of the hammock and flipped it over. Ah! Letting out a startled cry as he was unceremoniously dumped out of his hammock, Naruto just barely rolled out of the way of Anko's foot as she stomped down on the spot his crotch had been just a moment ago, but his laughter merely continued as he stood up a bit unsteadily while holding his aching ribs with one hand, his flute held in the other. He didn't have time to react, however, when a purple and brown blur slammed into him, tackling him to the ground and knocking his flute out of his hand. Straddling his waist, Anko raised her fists to start wailing on the red-haired asshole that had thought it would be funny to tease her in such a way, but before they could make contact, the Takebetsu Jounin found her wrists held in Naruto's much larger and much stronger hands. "Grr. Let me go, you bastard." Anko snarled as she struggled to break free, only causing Naruto to gain a shit-eating grin. "Why don't you make me?" He taunted playfully before leaning up and doing something that caught Anko completely off guard. He would later look back on that moment and wonder what it was that had provoked him to do such a thing, but he would never find an answer. "Fine then, you ass." Anko's pissed off retort was cut short as their lips met in a brief kiss, causing Anko's eyes to go as wide as they could go, while her face suddenly flushed a dark crimson. Still grinning a devil-may-care grin, Naruto leaned back, only for something else to happen that caught him off guard this time. Her mind still clouded with sexual frustration and the denial of gratification, Anko had proceeded to stop struggling against him and laid down on top of him, pressing her lips against his in a second kiss, this one being filled with passion and lust. Unable to resist at first, Naruto let his eyes close and started to return the lip lock, but when it came time for them to break apart for air a couple minutes later, Naruto regained his senses and tried to push Anko off of him. Anki was cut short when Anko kissed him again before nibbling on his ear with an irritated growl. "Shut up. You caused this." Now she paused momentarily to sit up a little more and stare directly into his eyes with their lips being millimeters apart, her finishing words whispered huskily. "Fix it." Anko had to force herself not to add a desperate please to the end of her statement, but being stubborn and headstrong, she refused to resort to begging, no matter how painfully aroused she became. Naruto was silent for a few moments as his mind tried to find a way out of the situation he had gotten himself into, only to find none. Seeing as escape was futile and his usual answer of burn it wouldn't work, his instinctually driven mind then came up with the only solution to the problem. "Fix it." Anko watched as another grin formed on his face, this one being smaller and more unnerving than his usual ones, before he suddenly rolled over on top of her, pinning her to the ground under his much larger size and weight as he captured her lips in another kiss, coaxing out a long and drawn-out moan of approval from the older woman, her hands having been pinned to the ground above her head by the redhead. "I was going to suggest that we move this to the bedroom. It'll be more comfortable there." Anko, unable to find her voice and left breathless from the last kiss, could only nod slowly and numbly as her cheeks burned with another fierce blush, idly wondering what she had just gotten herself into as Naruto stood up with her in his arms, her wrists pinned behind her back and held in Naruto's left hand while he held the back of her neck with his right. Her legs tightly wrapped around his waist as they engaged one another in a battle of the tongues, both fighting the other for dominance, something Anko was quickly losing as she struggled to free her hands. From memory alone, Naruto managed to make his way to his bedroom without much of a problem, despite the purple-haired distraction in his arms that absolutely refused to be ignored and seemed to demand his full attention at all times. Losing his grip on her wrists for only a split second, Anko took full advantage of it to shrug her coat off, which fell to the floor in a forgotten heap halfway between the brown bare fur door flap to Naruto's room and the bed. Moaning deeply into Naruto's mouth as he laid down on the bed on top of her, Anko's hypersensitive skin reacted to the soft and intoxicating feel of the wolf fur, nearly sending her over the edge as she gripped Naruto's shoulders. Tugging on Naruto's bottom lip with her teeth as they pulled apart for another breath of air, Anko pushed him up a little before reaching down and grabbing the hem of her shirt, pulling it up over her head before tossing it aside. As they engaged in yet another heated kiss a moment later, Anko managed to gain just enough leverage to roll Naruto over onto his back with her on top of him, only for her eyes to roll back in her head as another moan escaped her. Still fondling Anko's right breast with his left hand, Naruto channeled a touch of fire chakra into his hand while sitting up and taking the nipple of Anko's left breast into his mouth, the heat of his fire chakra sending unexpected waves of pleasure through the Kunoichi's body that were only intensified from him suckling her other breast. And Narng. Oh, God, don't stop. Pupils dilating thinly, Naruto started to lose himself amongst Anko's pleasured grunts and groans, his instincts screaming at him to mount the woman. However, he still retained rational thought through some miraculous event and knew better than to do anything she didn't want to do. Such restraint, however, was quickly thrown out the window when he felt Anko's hands fumbling with the rope tied around his waist in the place of a belt as their lips met in yet another passionate make-out session, making him smirk against her lips while a similar one formed on Anko's, both letting themselves get lost in the moment, the aftermath and consequences be damned. I'd kill you right now, but Anko trailed off for a moment, blushing fiercely as she glared at Naruto from across the room, lying on her back on the bed with a very comfortable and soft wolf fur blanket covering her naked form. Her blush intensifying, Anko looked away as she continued with what she was saying. But I can't feel my legs asshole. Hey, you're the one that told me to keep going. Naruto remarked while throwing his hands up in mock surrender, his fang-filled grin rendering the action meaningless. Having just got out of the shower, Naruto finished drying off and dressed himself in a fresh pair of pants, identical to the ones he had been wearing yesterday. Keeping his back towards Anko, Naruto started sliding his rope belt through the belt loops on his pants as his good mood shifted slightly. Just so you know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to push things so far. He always did have a problem with knowing when to quit. So I've noticed, Anko growled out with an even darker blush as she referred to Naruto's ungodly stamina, still refusing to look at the younger red-haired man. Sighing quietly, Naruto started binding his hands and forearms with his white cloth wrappings as he got ready to meet up with his team, sitting at the end of his bed. As he continued to quietly get ready, Anko stared at the back of her first lover as strange feelings and foreign emotions tugged at her chest, leaving her rather scared and confused. Despite being so abrupt and unexpected, Anko had thoroughly enjoyed the entire event and had been quite surprised but thankful when Naruto had been gentle and patient with her. She had no regrets, knowing that she couldn't have found anyone else more caring than the Slayer in front her, even if she spent the rest of her life searching, but a part of her couldn't help fearing that it had all been meaningless to the redhead. Go ahead and jump in the shower while I get started on breakfast. Naruto spoke up after several minutes of silence, cutting into Anko's thoughts as he slipped his necklace on over his head. Pausing at the doorway without looking back at Anko, who was now sitting up while clutching the covers to her chest, Naruto said something else that made Anko's heart flutter and skip a beat. You're welcome here anytime, Anko. This place is now just as much your home as it is mine. With that, he was gone and Anko was left speechless in his wake, a look of honest shock and surprise on her face as she stared at the now motionless bear fur that hung down in front of the opening. A small smile of genuine happiness formed as her eyes watered slightly with tears of joy, letting her mask fall completely in the sanctuary she had lost her virginity in. Although in a roundabout and rather unorthodox but pleasant way, Anko had found acceptance with another person. Maybe not love, but she had another precious person, and, apparently, so did Naruto. Forcing her emotional mask back into place while she hurriedly dried her eyes before Naruto saw them, just in case he came back into the room for something, Anko decided to see if she could make it to the bathroom for a nice hot shower. Moving to the edge of the bed, Anko experimentally put her bare feet on the smooth and level natural stone that made up the floor, shivering slightly from the cool feel of it on her warm soles. Biting her bottom lip as she smiled at the memories of how she lost feeling in her legs, the Takebetsu Jounin threw the blanket aside and slowly pushed herself up until she was standing, noticing how she was still a bit sore, numb and weak, but still capable of standing and possibly walking, which was proven correct after making her way to the bathroom. As she turned on the water to the shower and let it heat up before stepping under the warm streams of liquid, Anko's mind traitorously flittered back over to the redhead, making her frown slightly as she thought about how he might feel towards her and what happened between them yesterday, last night, and earlier that morning. Now that she actually thought about it, her lack of proper feeling in her legs really was her own fault. Out of all 19 rounds, she had been the one to instigate every last one. She was actually a bit surprised by her own stamina, considering that she had never had sex before, but she blamed it on her ninja training. Shaking her head and ducking under the water, Anko focused back on her previous line of thought. I hope this isn't some twisted dream or a trick. I don't know what I'd do if it was, as Anko thought to herself, suddenly feeling vulnerable, a feeling she loathed and despised with every fiber of her being. As similar thoughts drifted through her head, either adding on to or reducing her fears, Anko remained oblivious to the thoughts running through Naruto's mind. Operating on autopilot as he scrambled enough eggs to feed himself and his guest along with frying some shredded hash browns and diced venison sausage, Naruto couldn't stop himself from thinking about the woman currently using his shower. He couldn't stop cursing himself for what he did, having undoubtedly ruined his chances of ever becoming friends with possibly the only person that actually wanted to be his friend without already knowing him from some point in the past. A few minutes went by before he heard the shower stop, making him sigh once more and slouch a little. Here's to hoping that she doesn't hate my guts, Naruto thought to himself sourly with a faint grimace, straightening out his expression just seconds before Anko stepped out of his bedroom a few minutes later in the clothes she had worn yesterday, which he had a shadow clone wash in the lake last night before drying them with a good bit of heat generated from his fire chakra. Setting a plate of food in front of Anko as she sat down at the table, Naruto stayed silent while sitting down and eating his own meal. Breakfast was a silent affair, something that they were both thankful for and cursing at the same time, as it only made things feel all the more awkward. After they finished eating, silence continued to reign supreme in Naruto's home as he washed the dishes while Anko simply stayed sitting at the table. When he was done, Naruto leaned against the counter, staring down at the empty sink. Time to face the music. I've got to go meet my team now, but you can stick around and make yourself comfortable if you want. Like I said earlier, this place is now just as much your home as it is mine. Naruto stated calmly as he started making his way to the door with Anko following him out. Pausing just outside, Anko forced herself to grab his arm to stop him from leaving right away. Turning around and looking at her, he found her staring down at the ground as she kept her hand on his arm, her grip tightening slightly. Not even given a chance to worry about what she was going to do or what she was thinking, Naruto felt Anko's other hand gently grab his necklace and pulled on it to make him lean down before she suddenly kissed him on the cheek, leaving him surprised as his cheeks flushed slightly. Thanks for everything. Anko muttered nervously and shyly, a faint smile on her lips as she refused to look up at him. Letting go and walking away from him, Anko put her mask back into place before turning around and giving him a devious smirk that spoke of causing him pain. Don't think this changes anything, asshole, so don't get any ideas. I'm still pissed at you for what you did to me. With that, Anko turned back around and ran out of the cavern, leaving a stunned Naruto behind. Lightly touching his cheek where she had kissed him, Naruto blushed a little more before snorting out a puff of smoke and recompassing himself. Stuffing his hands in his pockets, Naruto left his home and started heading to Training Ground 13 to meet with his team, but for the rest of the day, no one could figure out why he was grinning. Hey Kurenai? Can I talk to you about something? Something that stays just between us? Anko inquired a bit nervously as she and her best friend, Yuuhi Kurenai, sat in a booth at the back of a shinobi-only bar they usually frequented while enjoying some sake. Caught by surprise by Anko's sudden change in mood, Kurenai became worried for her friend, who usually called her Nai-chan whenever they were hanging out. Yeah, of course, Anko. What's wrong? Well, that's just I don't know. Anko responded softly before eventually explaining what had happened between her and Naruto the day before and that morning. While she was angry with the redhead for seemingly taking advantage of her dear friend, Kurenai managed to calm down a little after she was told about what Naruto had told her and how apologetic he had been for his actions. He wasn't off the hook in Kurenai's opinion, but she would at least give him a chance to explain himself when she got a hold of him. After voicing such thoughts, however, Kurenai was once again surprised by Anko's response, which was actually a bit defensive of the Slayer. Leave him alone, Kurenai. I know he was being honest and it wasn't like I gave him much of a choice yesterday. Why are you defending him, Anko? He took advantage of you. Kurenai retorted, unable to figure out why Anko was standing up for the guy. Feeling insulted, Anko glared at her friend. He may have gotten the ball rolling at first, but I was the one that took advantage of him, Kurenai. Anko snapped sharply, actually making Kurenai flinch slightly. Ignoring it, Anko turned her eyes back down to the small dish in front of her, staring at a reflection in the alcohol before quickly downing it. He even offered to let me stay at his place whenever I want, and I could tell that he didn't have any ulterior motives when he said it. Either's a good guy, Kurenai. We might have gotten off to a weird and rocky start, but he's really nice once you get past his sarcasm and short temper. He's honest, too. That's something you can't find nowadays, an honest man that doesn't have a problem with speaking his mind. It's even rarer when you factor in that his life was far harder than anyone else's could ever be. I'm surprised he hasn't snapped yet. What do you mean? Kurenai inquired, only for Anko to shake her head negatively and ignore the question. Bidding her friend good night, Anko left the bar and started heading back to her apartment, her mind still stuck on the red-haired young man. Elsewhere, that same red-haired shinobi was lying in his hammock, reading one of his mother's journals. Like most of her other handwritten journals, which were more like guidebooks that she had started reading just after finding out that she was pregnant with him, it was categorized into a particular subject. One thing his mother had always kept hidden from other people was the fact she herself had been a slayer, but her Kirinketsu had only partially awoke, leaving her unable to progress in their bloodline and without the usual signs of their bloodline activating, the tattoos, eyes, claws, fangs, ears, etc. However, she was still very knowledgeable about them, since a large number of known slayers in the past came from their direct ancestry. This particular journal just happened to be about slayers and their unusual and always unexpected unorthodox courting methods and rituals. Since they were the closest thing he had to a mother's helpful advice, Naruto read them religiously, turning to them for assistance whenever he had a problem he couldn't solve the simple way by burning it to ash, which turned out to be a common personality quirk for slayers. They were almost always temperamental, and when added with the ability to breathe fire, it only made things worse for those that were the targets of a slayer's anger. Pushing those thoughts aside for the moment, Naruto focused back on the book in his hands and reread the page he was on. For us slayers, love at first sight doesn't exist. There's no destined soulmate or true love for us. When a slayer finds the person they would love for the rest of their life, it is usually under the most unexpected circumstances. An example of which is when I met my husband. When we were younger, I was naturally hot-headed and literally had no mental filter between my brain and my mouth, still don't really. Because of that, I was a hard person to get along with, and my husband, your father, was one of those people that didn't get along with me very well. That all changed one day when our tendency to clash, as it were, reached an all-new high, resulting in a rather vicious fight between us. We both suffered at least one broken bone, a large number of cuts and scratches, an even greater number of bruises, and a few nasty burns, in your father's case. Despite all of that, we shared our first kiss almost immediately after we stopped fighting. While we would still have our occasional disagreement or argument that would often end in a brawl between us, we were still head over heels in love with one another, and we were inseparable. Nothing could split us apart. Not even when I would banish him to the couch, embarrassingly enough. I would always end up caving during the night and sneak my way into the living room before lying down beside him. I can only hope and pray that you find your mate like I have. I know I've mentioned it before, but if you're reading any of these journals, I'm no longer alive, and Minato probably isn't either. If so, then I can only apologize because I know your life will be hard and cruel, but don't let it get to you. You'll find that special someone, and trust me when I say this, but you'll know who it is when that pain and discomfort of living such a brutal life is suddenly lessened just by their mere presence. Now, don't get me wrong, your mate won't necessarily be someone that you absolutely can't get along with like it was with me and Minato, but they will most definitely be just about as stubborn as you are and undeniably aggressive in certain areas. Really, Kachan? Naruto mumbled with a sigh, closing his eyes as he leaned his head back and tried to get the unwanted mental image out of his head. At least she had been honest, she really didn't have a mental filter, something he actually didn't have either. Now, was it a family thing or a slayer thing? Deciding to think about it another time, Naruto closed the leather-bound journal and tied the string around it to keep it closed, having read enough for the night. Leaving it lying on his chest, Naruto put his hands behind his head and stared up at the night sky through the weaving vines as the crescent moon shined down through it. I wonder if Anko is that special someone, Naruto thought to himself as he stared up at the moon, absently recalling every little detail about her, from her scent and her smile down to the scars that dotted her supple flesh, and how his forever constant anger would dwindle to nothing whenever he looked into her eyes. Sighing heavily, Naruto closed his eyes and relaxed, deciding to sleep in his hammock for tonight. It wasn't long before he fell asleep, thoughts of his currently absent lover drifting through his mind as he lost consciousness, only for her to invade his dreams. Kirin no Yuta Dragon's Song. Chapter 3. It had been a week since his encounter with Anko, and Naruto hadn't seen any trace of her. Because of it, Naruto had grown a bit more reclusive, as well as a bit more temperamental with others. He didn't exactly know how to react to what had happened between him and Anko or how it made him feel, even with the guidance of his mother's journals, and it was driving him nuts. Not only that, but she hadn't stopped by to at least tell him not to bother her again or anything. Then, somehow, the Sandaime found out about it yesterday and Naruto had to sit through a rather long and irritating lecture that morning, but what made it worse was the fact Kakashi had walked in on the lecture, heard what was going on, and had proceeded to tease Naruto on occasion since then. The redhead knew the Jounin meant well and was merely playing around, but if he kept it up, so, it was your first time, huh? And with one of Konoha's most beautiful kunoichi, at that. That just earned you 5 more points on your man card. Naruto closed his eyes as he tried and failed to restrain himself. Senku Taihu. Naruto bellowed furiously as he spun around, a thin halo of fire forming around his fist as he cocked it back, Kakashi's lone eye widening with fear and shock. He had seen the damage the attack could cause, and the Jounin did not want to get hit by one at point-blank range. Throwing a straight punch with his right hand, the fire ring around his fist suddenly grew larger and stronger before continuing on when his fist stopped, forming a meter-wide perfectly smooth sphere of red fire that shot forward at the speed of a cannonball. Just barely managing to switch out with a log via Kawarimi, Kakashi watched as the Senku Taihu burned the log to ash in an instant, while continuing on to impact a line of trees roughly 100 meters further into the training ground, detonating in a powerful explosion that kicked up a stiff gust of scorching hot wind from the concussive force of the blast wave alone. The flames erupting in a brilliant display of reds and oranges as they incinerated everything within a 50-foot radius of the impact point. It was only one of several air rank ninjutsu techniques that Naruto had created and mastered at some point in the past. Breathing heavily out of anger alone, Naruto let his hand drop back down to his side, oblivious to the fact his eyes had turned a soul-piercing golden amber during his moment of fury. Snorting out a large cloud of black smoke, Naruto spun around on his heel and stormed off as his eyes slowly bled back into their usual crimson. Still cowering behind the memorial stone, Kakashi could only stare at the flaming crater left behind by Naruto's attack with a single wide eye, shivering in fear as he thought about the crater being him if he had been hit by the technique. What was even scarier was the fact that, despite it being an A-rank technique, Naruto was capable of throwing it around all day long, like it was candy at a festival parade before he even started to get tired, while anyone else would have been exhausted after using it once. His mind blank with irritation, Naruto didn't realize where he was going until he found himself walking down a familiar path that led back to his home. Sighing heavily with a slight growl, Naruto decided it was for the best that he just stayed home for the rest of the day. Going to his haven and gently brushing the vines aside after putting his bone swords, armor, and wrappings away in his room, Naruto walked over to his hammock and picked up his flute, idly noticing that he kept forgetting it in his hammock. Sitting down without lying in it, Naruto stared at the small musical instrument for a moment. "It's not like I have anything better to do," Naruto muttered as he moved to bring the flute to his lips, only for his eyes to suddenly flick over to his anvil and the piles of metal around it. Smiling faintly as he recalled some of his past creations, Naruto stood up while a cage bunchen popped into existence beside him. Passing his flute over to his clone, who proceeded to lay down in the hammock, Naruto walked over to the anvil and picked up his hammer, grinning slightly. It had been a few months since he last made anything. Reaching down and picking up a good-sized piece of high-grade metal, Naruto inspected it for a moment before thinking of what to do with it. His fanged grin became a bit softer and more peaceful as he made his decision. As his clone started playing a random song to help pass the time and fill the silence of the cave, Naruto took a deep breath before exhaling an insanely hot and steady stream of fire onto the metal that soon made the steel glow orange from the heat in only a handful of seconds. Despite having his hand in the fire directly and holding onto the glowing metal itself, Naruto wasn't bothered by it, having a natural invulnerability to fire and heat of all levels due to his bloodline. Resting the superheated metal down on top of the anvil, Naruto grabbed his hammer and raised it before swiftly bringing it back down on the metal, gradually shaping it into a rough image of what he had in mind. 3 weeks later, Naruto had finished his project, resorting to sending a cage bunchen in his place for team missions and training. Kakashi had stopped by after the first day to complain about it, but after hearing Naruto's argument, the Jounin couldn't contest the Uzumaki's point and let it be. Team 7 wasn't a team, 1 was an arrogant, spoiled, and mentally unstable brat that thought he was the emperor with a lone avenger complex. 1 was a cowardly little girl with a speech impediment and self-esteem issues, and had no knowledge whatsoever of the darkness of the world. He himself was a pyromanic brute with anger problems that couldn't get along with others, and Kakashi was a perverted slacker with no sense of time that was stuck in the past. Because of their inability to connect properly in order to work together, Naruto saw no reason to even bother showing up in person until the need arose to do such. Personally, though, he would have already started on trying to help Hinata regain her self-confidence and, with his particular methods of teaching, pretty much force the Hyuga heiress to grow a spine or simply break her in the process, but he was still too emotionally volatile at the moment and would just as easily shatter the young girl's mind as he would try to build her back up. That, however, wasn't on his mind at the moment. Naruto didn't move as he stared at the black wooden stand that held two of the finest works he had ever crafted, lying on his back on a cluster of wolf fur cushions in the den, with the stand sitting just a couple feet away from his head, which hung over the edge of one of the cushions. The stand, which he had made as well, held a wakizashi with a deep crimson blade that bore snow-white stylized flower petals drifting across the blade on either side of it, no guard, and a deep crimson wooden handle that seamlessly connected with a deep crimson wooden sheath that came with it. The pattern of more snow-white stylized flower petals dancing along the length of the sheath as if they were blowing in the wind, just as they were depicted on the blades. Directly below the wakizashi on the stand was a similarly crafted tanto. He had decided to name the wakizashi Gurin and the tanto Tanka. The weapons themselves, though, weren't on his mind, either. It was the person he had made them for who still hadn't stopped by. She probably doesn't want anything to do with me. Not that I blame her, Naruto thought to himself before sighing heavily and getting up, setting the stand and both blades on a shelf in his room before stepping outside, his head bowed slightly and gaze lowered. Naruto. The voice made Naruto freeze, and as he slowly raised his head and looked up at the person, he had to force himself not to act any differently than he normally would. Are you busy? To want to talk about what happened? Not really, no. I was fixing to go get something for dinner, but that was about it. Naruto responded as he took a moment to examine Anko, noticing that she seemed a bit nervous. However, he didn't see any of the insecurity or uncertainty that had been in her body language a month ago when he had last seen her. At the mention of food, however, Anko's stomach suddenly growled and she couldn't stop the fierce blush of embarrassment from forming on her cheeks, looking away shyly. Smirking with a slight chuckle, Naruto shook his head as he started walking towards the tunnel that led out of the cave, gently putting his hand on her shoulder as he paced. Come on. I'll be nice and let you pick. Hell, I'll even pay. Consider it compensation. He never saw the evil look in Anko's eyes or the bit of drool at the corner of her mouth as she followed behind him, thinking about how much dango she'd be able to get. Alright, speak. What's on your mind? Naruto spoke up after internally complaining about how empty his wallet was now. Granted, a good bit of the cost at the dango stand Anko took him to was from himself due to his much larger appetite, but they had also stopped by a bar Anko frequented before ordering a case of sake, along with a few extra bottles. While Anko had only wanted a few bottles, Naruto had gotten the case for himself, telling her that it took far more than a few drinks to get him drunk and he didn't want to feel left out if they were going to get shit-faced. Now, carrying the 4-foot cubic wooden crate on his left shoulder while Anko carried a bag with her self-purchased bottles of sake, they were heading back to his home. In reaction to his question, Anko suddenly blushed slightly but refrained from speaking up until they were almost to the tunnel entrance. Well, guess I should start off by apologizing about my behavior that day. I guess I was a bit forceful at times and I didn't exactly give you the chance to calm me down, so I'm sorry. Anko finally explained as they passed through the tunnel and came upon the path of river rocks that led from the shore down to Naruto's island. Snorting out a puff of smoke, Naruto smirked again and shook his head, his reaction confusing Anko and irritating her a little. And just what's so funny? I'm trying to apologize for nothing. Remember what I said when we first met? Naruto finished and then questioned, confusing Anko a little more. Rolling his eyes, Naruto set the crate down before turning back towards the woman, who was opening up one of her bottles of sake, while Naruto took one out of the crate for himself. I like it when people stand up to me, so there's nothing for you to apologize for. Besides, I should have been more forceful myself and made you calm down. Either that or I shouldn't have kept up the teasing like I did. Anko blushed heavily while plopping down into Naruto's hammock, mumbling something incoherent under her breath after taking a swig of her drink. What was that? You're going to have to speak louder than that. Naruto remarked before downing almost half of his bottle of sake in only a few gulps, while simultaneously sitting down in front of the crate and leaning back against it. Blushing even more heavily, Anko became a bit irritated from having to repeat herself, along with being thoroughly embarrassed by having to say the words again. I said I didn't mind, you were my first and I loved it. Okay, Anko yelled before her entire face turned a dark red, Naruto's eyes going wide in surprise by what she had just said. Even more embarrassed by what she said, Anko quickly looked away before chugging the bottle of sake in her hand, leaving herself breathless in the end and starting to feel the beginnings of a slight buzz. Drinking the second half of his bottle, Naruto calmly set it down before reaching into the crate and pulling out another bottle as Anko followed his example. Calming down a bit, Anko opened her fresh bottle and took a drink from it. I don't know what it was that made me do it, but when you kissed me, I felt I don't know how to describe it. It was like a jolt of electricity that shot through me, and suddenly, everything was so much clearer. Yes, you drove me to the brink of insanity with that damn genjutsu, but when you kissed me that first time, Anko continued to explain her feelings, while Naruto simply stayed silent and listened, already opening his third bottle. She suddenly scoffed and rolled her eyes at a thought. This is going to sound really cliché and cheesy, but I can't think of any other way to explain it. When you kissed me that first time, I felt like my life went from being stuck in a chaotic shitstorm to being in a peaceful paradise. That doesn't sound very cliché to me. I mean, look at where we are right now, Naruto remarked, gesturing to his little hideaway, his home. Down the first half of his beverage, Naruto tilted his head back and stared up at the screen of vines covering the hole in the ceiling, noticing how the sky was getting darker as dusk progressed into night. I never imagined that I'd ever find a place like this. But I did. And to be honest, never thought I'd find someone that actually liked me from Ebit I died, or at least, I thought I did. Naruto, Anko whispered with a look of shock and a bit of hope, wondering if he was talking about her or not. Snorting out a decent-sized cloud of soot particles, Naruto finished the rest of his bottle. Yeah, the old man was right, Naruto mumbled with a humorless smirk and a slight shake of his head as he grabbed himself another bottle of sake. Deep and emotional thinking just doesn't suit me very well. Well, I think it does, Anko mumbled out around the opening in the bottle, her words going unheard as she, once again, averted her gaze to somewhere other than Naruto. That was when Naruto thought of something, wanting to redirect the conversation from melodramatic emotions to something more lively and entertaining. Like a drinking game. Hey Anko. Do you know how to play three-man? Naruto inquired while seemingly pulling out a couple dice from thin air. Cocking an eyebrow, Anko slowly shook her head negatively, uncertain as to what Naruto was planning. Said redhead only started grinning impishly. Don't worry, I'll teach you. Anko sighed with an odd mix of contentment and boredom, currently lying in bed with Naruto, who was still passed out. While she had only had a couple bottles last night and didn't get too drunk, nor did she suffer from a hangover, Naruto had helped himself to well over 3 dozen, leaving him unconscious for a good while. Unlike the last time she woke up in the redhead's bed, she was still dressed in her dark purple panties and her fishnet top, while Naruto himself was still dressed in his pants. Looking around Naruto's bedroom and actually paying attention this time, Anko saw things she hadn't seen last time. One wall was completely hidden behind a couple bookshelves of similar design as his dresser, each one completely filled with scrolls and books, while on the wall beside the bed, there were a handful of shelves that held a number of objects. That was when her eyes caught sight of something red on one of the shelves and got curious. Gently slipping out from under Naruto's arm and getting out of bed, she walked over to it and found it to be a beautifully decorated wakizashi in tanto, only to notice something carved into the stand that supported both items and proceeded to read it out loud to herself, but quietly so as not to disturb Naruto. Like the petals of wilting flowers, droplets of blood shall fall from thy blades. Wow, impressive. Anko muttered before reading the names to both weapons, the kanji having been carved into the stand just beneath where the handles were resting, Gurin and Tanka. Gently lifting the wakizashi, Gurin, from its cradle, Anko tenderly held it in her hands and slowly unsheathed the blade a little bit, only to gasp quietly when she saw just how well made it was, along with the design on the blade, which she realized was actually stained red somehow, instead of being painted like most others would be, even the petals had been stained into the metal. From the bed, Naruto couldn't help smiling slightly, glad to know that she liked them, now he just had to figure out how to give them to her. He had woken up almost as soon as she slipped out from under his arm and, after seeing what time it was, had sent out a Kage Bunshin to deal with his team for the day while Anko was distracted. Do you like them? He asked suddenly, making Anko squeak and jump slightly out of startlement. Blushing furiously, Anko sheathed the blade again and set it back on the stand before turning back around to Naruto, nodding slightly. Yes, they're beautiful. She answered before suddenly shivering a little bit, finally noticing that it was a bit chilly in the room. Crawling back into bed and under the covers, Anko quickly snuggled up against Naruto, who was always unnaturally warm and made her think of him as a human space heater. Looking up at him as she started to warm back up, Anko rested her chin on his chest. Where did you find them? They must have cost a fortune. I didn't find them and I didn't buy them. I made them. Naruto's answer shocked Anko to her core, prompting him to give her a fanged smirk at the look on her face. What? You think I have that anvil and metal out there for decoration? I've been forging weapons for almost 6 years, Anko. I originally took it up in order to better train my fire affinity, but it eventually just became a hobby and an extra source of income on the side. You're just full of surprises, aren't you? Anko mumbled with a huff before resting her head on Naruto's chest, pressing her body flush against Naruto's with her hand resting on his chest, a small sigh of contentment escaping her as she smiled softly, her brown eyes closing tiredly. My, you are really comfy, you know that. I'm what? Naruto muttered quietly with surprise, actually blushing a little. being called comfy wasn't something he was used to hearing. In fact, it was the first time anyone had called him that or anything close to it. However, instead of answering him, Anko yawned tiredly as the warmth coming off of him was starting to lull her back to sleep. Turning over on her side with her back to him and curling up slightly with her head resting on his shoulder, Anko started dozing off. Smiling slightly, Naruto hesitantly rolled onto his side as well and wrapped an arm around the small female, holding her flush against him. It was still kind of early in the morning and they hadn't gone to bed until late last night, so he guessed that a few more hours of rest wouldn't hurt. Holding her a bit tighter to him and making sure she was comfortable, Naruto lightly kissed the side of Anko's neck just below her jaw, making her smile sleepily and quietly mew with approval. Sweet dreams, Anko. My Naruto-kun, Anko mumbled softly before going silent once more, drifting off into a peaceful slumber, while Naruto blushed at the simple but affectionate pet name. His blush slowly got worse, however, when he realized Anko had called him her Naruto-kun, deciding to just ignore it, Naruto figured she had only said it because she was halfway between consciousness and sleep, thus, she just slurred whatever it was she was actually trying to say. That had to be it. Sighing heavily, Naruto shoved those thoughts aside and buried his nose in her hair, closing his eyes as he relaxed and soon started to fall asleep as well. At around noon, Naruto slowly woke up just as Anko was getting out of bed, her movement being the cause that had disturbed his slumber. Silently watching as she headed towards the bathroom while taking her shirt off, Naruto couldn't stop himself from staring at her nearly bare rear, but then again, he wouldn't stop himself even if he wanted to. Her ass was simply too perfect to ignore, and he was simply too shameless to not blatantly stare. He was caught, however, when Anko paused in the doorway to the bathroom for a moment to toss her shirt behind her, only to find him staring at her. Although she blushed and looked a bit embarrassed about it for a moment, Anko quickly gained a seductive smile as she took pride in the fact she had his interest while locking eyes with Naruto. Not saying a word, Anko kept her back to him as she pulled her hair tie out and let her hair fall freely to reach down just past her shoulder blades, before slowly taking her panties off, bending over at the waist in an over-exaggerated way to ensure his attention was focused entirely on her butt, only to disappear behind the bare skin that hung down in front of the bathroom door, just as they did for almost every other doorway in his home. Damn tease, Naruto grumbled quietly with a mock pout before hearing the shower running. Getting an idea and smirking mischievously, Naruto got out of bed and started getting undressed as well. Sure, he was taking a big risk of getting his ass kicked, but he didn't much care about that. It's not like he wouldn't heal. Besides, he wouldn't have to take a shower later and it would give them more time to do something else. So, silently slipping into the bathroom, Naruto snuck into the shower behind Anko before suddenly wrapping his arms around her waist and lifting her up off the ground. AHHH. Naruto. You jackass. Anko screamed, only to start laughing, which kind of surprised the Slayer a bit. He had expected her to freak out and either kick him out of the shower or try to beat the shit out of him, if not attempt both at the same time, but not for her to laugh. As he set her back down on her feet, he voiced his confusion, only for Anko to look up at him with her own look of confusion. You don't remember our conversation last night? The one we had before we fell asleep? You may remember everything up until the moment I started playing my flute last night. Everything after that is a blur. Naruto admitted casually while scratching under his chin. Anko sighed heavily before grabbing the bar of soap and, after letting Naruto under the water for a moment, started rubbing it on the redhead's body with a slight blush, talking as she did. We were talking about what was going to happen to you know, us. Did you know that you like to express yourself and your emotions a whole lot more when you're drunk? Anko inquired while looking back up into Naruto's eyes, smiling a bit teasingly. Grumbling under his breath with a fierce blush of embarrassment, Naruto looked away. He did not know that little fact about himself. Now that he did, he would have to be careful about who he drank around in the future, as well as how much he drank around them, which sucked because he really liked getting hammered, but that was mostly because he had the miraculous gift of never having to suffer through a hangover. Focusing back on her self-appointed task of washing her lover's body, Anko continued with what she was saying. You said that you had been a wreck the entire time I was gone. That you would wake up, expecting to find me in your arms, only to be disappointed and heartbroken at the same time when you found that I wasn't. You even admitted that I was your first lover, as well. I still don't see how that's possible with how good you are. Naruto said nothing as his blush only worsened while still glaring at the wall, something that made Anko snicker, glad to know she was still able to tease him about something. While a bit difficult, she now knew that it wasn't impossible to embarrass the giant and she was going to enjoy herself while doing so on occasion. While she finished with him, Naruto ducked back under the water to rinse off before taking the soap from Anko's hand and giving her a brief kiss before she could attempt any sort of protest or objection. A moment later and it was now Anko's turn to blush once more as Naruto returned the favor by washing her body for her, standing behind her as he did. She was silent for a couple minutes until after Naruto was finished and she rinsed off, setting the bar of soap back in its proper spot on the wall. Naruto stayed behind her with his arms gently wrapped around her, letting her lean back against his chest as they simply relaxed under the warm rivulets of water for the moment. I practically confessed my own feelings for you, too. I told you that the reason I didn't come by or anything was because I was afraid. I didn't know what I was feeling and it scared me. Plus, I didn't know how you felt about everything. I was afraid that what we shared that night meant nothing to you. Anko paused slightly at that moment with a frown as she looked down, only to suddenly feel Naruto's clawed fingers cup her chin and tilt her head back before he captured her lips once again. Moaning softly into the tender and loving lip lock, Anko was left breathless and stunned when they broke apart after only a few seconds, her eyes glazed over as she stared into Naruto's. What we shared, while unintended, is something that I'll cherish for the rest of my life, Anko. For the first time, I was able to feel love and everything that came with it, and not in a familial way, either. It was a love between mates. Whether we stay together or never see each other again after this, just remember that every time I look back on what we shared, I'll think of you and I'll smile. If you want to be with me, we can go at whatever pace you want, so long as you're happy. I know I am just by having you near me. Naruto, who hadn't broken eye contact the entire time he spoke, finished by kissing Anko again with more passion and emotion than before. Moaning softly, Anko slowly turned around and pressed herself against him, neither one wanting the moment to end. As they slowly separated, Anko couldn't stop the tears from welling up in her brown eyes as she smiled up at him. Seeing the tears, however, Naruto started to worry that he might have said something wrong, but before he could try to apologize, Anko pulled him down once more and gave him a soft kiss on the lips that lasted for only a moment. You said those same exact words last night, all the way down to the kiss. At first, I had thought it was just the alcohol, so I didn't think much of it. Now, I know that it was your heart. Anko trailed off for a moment to wipe her eyes and take a calming breath, unable to believe what she was about to say, letting her right hand rest on the left side of Naruto's chest, directly over his heart, while she took his right hand in her left. Naruto was surprised when she took his hand and placed it over her left breast so that it rested over her own heart, but not exactly in a sexual manner. I'm not very good with words, so I'm just going to come out and say it, okay? I didn't know what it was that I was feeling, but after talking with the Sandaime and my friend Kurenai, I now know that what I was feeling was love. Anko at Naruto cut himself short while Anko smiled at him, taking another deep breath to settle her nerves as she gathered the courage to finally say it. I love you, Naruto-kun, she admitted softly. Naruto's eyes went wide and he didn't say anything for several long moments, staring off into the distance blankly. Growing worried and a bit fearful because of her still lingering insecurities, Anko tried to get a response out of him. And no, she was interrupted, however, when she felt Naruto smash his lips against hers. Feeling his tongue press against her lips, she opened her mouth and allowed him access, moaning heartily as their tongues rubbed against one another. Slowly looping her arms around his neck and shoulders, Anko felt that all too familiar fire ignite within her core as she hooked one leg around Naruto's hip and waist, pressing closer to him. Feeling one of his hands squeezing her butt cheek as he started groping her left breast with his other hand, Anko grinned into his mouth while blindly reaching over and turning the water off, only to be pushed up against the wall a moment later, drawing out another deep moan from her. She then put her hands on Naruto's chest and pushed him back a bit while regaining her footing, catching him off guard and confusing him slightly. Dry off. I want to do this in the bed, okay? Anko asked softly, getting a smile from Naruto and a kiss on the forehead, something that made her blush slightly. One of her greatest desires in a man was one that would spoil her, but still know when to say no. So far, Naruto had filled every single requirement she had, even forcing her to come up with a couple new ones, and they didn't really know each other all that well, but she didn't care about that so much anymore. As they dried off and made their way back to the bed, Anko smirked deviously, only to push Naruto onto his back and straddle him, deciding to tease him until he was practically begging, just like he had done to her with that genjutsu of his. Naruto-kun. Anko groaned as she woke up the next morning, finding herself alone in bed. A moment later, she heard the sound of metal striking metal, which made her eyes snap wide open before she hurried out of bed. Quickly getting dressed and heading outside as she pulled her trench coat on, Anko stopped and sighed, finding that it was only Naruto as he hammered away at a piece of superheated steel. She could tell that he hadn't noticed her yet, and knowing that, she decided to try and sneak up on him for once. Just barely getting past the vines, Anko froze when she saw Naruto pause in his work, wondering if he had detected her or not. That son of a bitch. Naruto suddenly bellowed while throwing the still glowing piece of metal, which was roughly shaped into that of a cleaver-like blade, as hard as he could while dropping his hammer. The blade soon found itself buried in the wall across the water, while Naruto continued on his sudden and, so far, unexplained rampage. That little shit has the balls to demand a higher ranking mission, and the old bastard allows it. Does everyone in this village worship that spoiled Uchiha fuck? Anko stayed quiet and motionless as smoke started to billow out of Naruto's mouth and nostrils before he quickly moved out over the water a good distance beyond the veil of vines and expelled a massive gout of flame straight into the air that caused the nearby rock to glow and melt slightly from the sheer intensity of the heat while the water under his feet began to boil and evaporate, leaving him hidden within a dense cloud of steam and black smoke as the flames quickly died down after a few seconds. Breathing heavily from his short-lived fury, Naruto took a moment to calm back down to a more civil level before walking over to where he had thrown his newest project. Grabbing onto what would have been the handle, Naruto yanked it out of the stone and glanced over it before growling under his breath, another stream of onyx smog leaking out of his mouth. Fuck, I'm going to have to start over. Naruto grumbled while walking back to the island, glancing up just as he reached it and noticed that Anko was there. Quickly looking away as he felt a little ashamed that she had undoubtedly seen him lose his temper so bad, Naruto set the metal object down on the anvil. I'm sorry you had to see that, Anko. Relax, Naruto-kun. Now, would you mind explaining what that was all about? She asked while walking over to Naruto and following him back inside. Recalling his clone's memories, Naruto growled quietly but kept himself from losing his temper again. My team had gone to the administration building to get a mission for the day, but that spoiled little shit Uchiha Sasuke just had to throw a tantrum and demand a higher ranking mission on the justification that he needed to get stronger, Naruto explained, scoffing as he started binding his hands and feet with his cloth wrappings. After he finished and started strapping his greaves on, he continued. That's not all, either. That worthless bastard, Haddock, in his infinite wisdom, backed him up, and what made it all worse was the fact that the old man actually gave them the damn mission. Hey, calm down, okay? Anko urged as she came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his neck and shoulders, resting her chin on his shoulder while gently kissing him on the side of his neck. Idly wondering when she figured out how to calm him down so easily, Naruto did as he was told and relaxed a little bit, but he was still quite irritated. So, what's the mission? Just a stupid C-rank escort mission to Wave Country. Naruto answered while letting Anko pull him back so that he was lying down on the bed with his head in her lap. Some old drunk wants us to protect him while he builds a bridge that's supposed to connect Wave Country with Fire Country or something like that. It should only take a couple weeks. Just be careful. I don't want you taking any unnecessary risks, and if I find out that you did, I'm going to make you regret it. Got that? Anko urged at first before threatening him with a glare, getting a smirk out of Naruto. Huffing slightly, Anko tucked her bangs behind an ear before leaning down and gently kissing him, making a mental note to put her hair back up before she left. Reaching up, Naruto lightly ran his fingers through Anko's purple locks thoughtfully, an odd look forming on his face. Cocking an eyebrow as she remained hunched over slightly, Anko tilted her head slightly, idly leaning into Naruto's gentle touch when he cupped her cheek. What's that look for? You should leave your hair down more often. You look beautiful like this. Naruto answered a bit absent-mindedly, making Anko blush heavily, but she didn't protest the idea. Letting out a huff of half-hearted annoyance, Anko sat up and lightly shoved the redhead in an attempt to get him to move. Come on, get up. You said you have a mission, so finish getting ready and go. Anko grumbled, trying to hide how flustered she was by the compliment by trying to get Naruto ready to leave. Mumbling under his breath about bossy women, Naruto grew up and strapped his bracers on before sliding his bone swords into place behind his waist under his rope belt. As he tied his hit-aid around his left bicep, Anko stepped up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, smiling happily as she rubbed her cheek against his warm back. She just couldn't get over how warm he was, and she knew that she would love and abuse such a thing when winter came around in a few months. She nearly pouted when Naruto pried her arms off of him, but managed to cover it up with a slight scowl. Jerky was enjoying myself. Hey, who's the one that was trying to get me to leave a moment ago? Naruto shot back, making Anko actually pout childishly this time as she plopped down on the bed with her arms crossed over her chest, glaring off to the side. Openly laughing at her reaction, Naruto started heading outside while Anko begrudgingly followed after him, putting her hair up in its usual style and putting her hit-aid on as she did. Though secretly reluctant, they both went their separate ways after agreeing to meet back up when Naruto returned from his mission. As he arrived at the gate, Naruto let his displeasure be known almost as soon as he landed, black smoke continuously rolling out from the corners of his mouth and nostrils as he glared at the Uchiha, who seemed pretty smug for getting what he wanted. Well. You've finally decided to grace Kakashi's taunt was cut short when Naruto turned his narrowed eyes on him. The Jounin wasn't sure why, but the fact that he didn't feel any killing intent coming from the redhead and wasn't pressured to dodge any kind of deadly attack kind of worried him. What was even more unnerving was the fact that he had absolutely no idea what it was he did to anger the Slayer. Would have to pay close attention to what he said and did around Naruto for a while. For the moment, however, he held his hands up in defeat. Alright. I got the message, I'll stop. So, you think I'll be okay with these guys protecting me? Tazuna whispered almost conspiratorially from beside Naruto while looking towards the others. The bridge builder then took a drink of his sake before continuing. I mean, the brat looks like he could barely fight his way out of a wet paper bag, and the girl looks like she's super afraid of her own shadow. Then there's that sensei of yours, are you sure such a super laid-back and irresponsible looking guy is as reliable as he said he was? Instead of answering the man's questions, Naruto simply stared down at Tazuna with a blank expression before grinning wickedly. You know what, Tazuna-san? I think you and me are going to become good friends. Are we there yet? Naruto inquired from the back of the group in a bored tone, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he slouched slightly. Having been asked the same question every 5 minutes since they left camp that morning, Kakashi was quite irritated by the redhead. Damn it, Naruto. No, we're not there yet and we won't be until sometime tomorrow afternoon. Kakashi snapped without looking back at Naruto, but if he did, he would have seen the mischievous grin on his face, having been purposefully irritating the man all morning to entertain himself and to help pass the time. Walking at a civilian's pace was boring and slow, but Naruto honestly liked the opportunity to just relax and take it easy, being uptight and serious all the time wasn't his thing. Sure, he was pissed off almost all the time, but that was because of other people's stupidity. Now that he was outside of the village for the first time in the past year, Naruto felt at peace. Bored, but at peace. Ignoring his team as Hinata struck up a conversation with Tazuna and Kakashi, Naruto stuffed his hands in his pockets and was going to simply enjoy the peace and serenity of the forest while he could, but he caught a faint scent on the wind, his eyes narrowing in response. It was a scent he was quite familiar with. What are you doing here, Kira? Naruto mentally questioned despite knowing that he wouldn't get an answer. He knew that if Kira was around, so were her 3 students. Snorting out a small cloud of smoke, Naruto focused his senses more and examined his surroundings more accurately without drawing attention to himself. He could smell 2 scents, both male, that he recognized as the demon brothers. But why were they possibly working with Kira? As far as he knew, Maizu and Gaozu had a vendetta against Kira for killing their older sister while they were on conflicting missions. Naruto knew because he had been there. Geez, this just keeps getting more and more complicated. Why can't things just go smoothly for once? Sighing heavily as he and his team passed by a rather innocent-looking puddle, Naruto casually pulled his hands out of his pocket before drawing his swords. Jumping back a couple feet, Naruto easily avoided the bladed chain of the demon brothers, only to spin and thrust both of his swords forward, skewering their extended gauntleted arms, making them both scream in pain and drawing the attention of his teammates and their client. Twisting the blade slightly and causing them both to drop to their knees with another pair of screams, Naruto slowly turned his head towards Kakashi with a cold look in his eyes that made the Jounin shiver. Get them out of here, Haddock. I have history with these two. Naruto growled out before turning back around to face the 2 Chunin-level shinobi in front of him as they writhed in agony, clutching at their still impaled arms as they let out pain grunts and whimpers. Knowing it was best to simply listen at the moment, Kakashi started leading the rest of Team 7 and Tazuna away from the area. Once they were gone, Naruto roughly and brutally yanked his swords free, the near-invisible serrated teeth running along the edge of his blades, ripping into the already injured flesh of their forearms, drawing out twin cries of pain from the demon brothers. Before either brother could attempt to even think of retaliating, Naruto stabbed his swords through their uninjured hands, staking them to the ground and drawing out another pair of screams. His eyes only narrowed darkly as he snarled quietly, black smoke leaking out of his mouth. I want answers and I want them now. Why are you here? The old man. We were hired to kill the old man. Gaozu howled when Naruto purposefully pulled on his sword slightly before pushing on it, causing the serrated edge to grind against one of the bones in his hand, partially sawing into it. Naruto only growled louder than before as he ripped his sword free of Gaozu's hand, only to expel a small fireball, painfully burning the man's right leg before stabbing his sword back into Gaozu's hand, ignoring his screams. Don't bullshit with me, Gaozu. I know that's not why you're really here. Naruto snapped before shoving his sword down, causing it to bury itself into the ground up to the guardless hilt, keeping Gaozu's hand where it was as he crouched down and grabbed Maizu by the neck. I suggest you start talking, Gaozu. Maizu here looks pretty cold, maybe I should help him warm up. Don't you touch him, you bastard. Gaozu growled at the redhead, watching as Naruto slowly turned his gaze back to him as black smoke billowed out of his slightly open mouth and from his nostrils. Gritting his teeth, Gaozu knew he had been defeated, there was nothing he could do now. Kira. We took this job so that we had a shot at getting back Akira for killing our sister. Tenchi, you can do whatever you want with me, just let Maizu go. Maizu was silenced by a debilitating punch to the face, nearly knocking him out as Naruto growled at him. Brandishing his claws, Naruto held them at Maizu's throat. Where is she? The redhead snarled while Gaozu was growing more and more fearful for his brother's life as one of the giant's obsidian claws gently grazed Mizu's neck, easily slicing through the cloth covering it and leaving a thin scratch that drew a single drop of blood. Don't make me repeat myself, Gaozu. Wave country. Go to Taifu village and then head 7 kilometers due east. Go 3 kilometers north from there. You'll find a bungalow built on the side of a tree. She'll be there. Gaozu directed, biting back a curse as the sword was ripped from his hand, his brother unable to resist it as well. Before Mizu could say or do anything, Naruto thrust his bone blades toward them once more, piercing their hearts and killing them. Pulling his weapons free, Naruto took a moment to clean them of blood before breathing a decent-sized flame onto the corpses that burnt them to ash within minutes. Sheathing his swords once more, Naruto stuffed his hands back in his pockets and started walking back down the road, his eyes narrowed and fiercer than usual. Chapter 4 Water Country. Said to have beaches of the softest and warmest white sands with the best waves for surfers. It was also under absolute lockdown, engaged in a civil war between two factions and over one thing, bloodlines. The anti-bloodline faction, based almost entirely out of Kurigakure no Sato, hunted down and slaughtered countless people just because they possessed a bloodline, something brought about by the Yonde Mizukage for some strange, unknown reason. The pro-bloodline faction was best described as a guerrilla force of rebels made up of those with, and even without, bloodlines, as they fought for the lives of other bloodline wielders and their own. Because of the civil war, people didn't come to Water Country anymore, fearing that they might get caught in the fighting. One person, however, disregarded such dangers in search of several things. A dark shadow moved swiftly through the water from below the surface, appearing almost as if it were in its natural element while using the waves to help propel it forward. As it drew closer to shore, however, it was quickly discovered that it wasn't a creature of the sea when a rather tall boy of about 10 years of age stood up in the waist-deep shallows, his crimson hair, reaching almost halfway down his back, plastered to his bare torso as he trudged through the last few meters of seawater, dark red tribal tattoos decorating his face and neck, his entire back, most of his chest, and down to his elbows on his arms. He was dressed in a pair of baggy dark red pants that seemed a bit too big on him with white tribal flame designs covering the leggings from the cuffs that dragged on the ground all the way up to about where his knees were, and a solid white rope was tied around his waist in the form of a belt with the two knotted ends having been dyed dark crimson. Rubier eyes bearing black slit pupils rested in pools of obsidian as they glanced from one side to the other in search of any possible threats, his pointed ears listening for any sounds of battle or movement while he sniffed the air, checking for hostile scents. Finding none, the boy suddenly heaved a heavy sigh and slumped to the ground, feeling terribly exhausted after swimming from Fire Country's eastern shore all the way across the sea to Water Country. Never again, I'm never swimming across that damn ocean ever again, Naruto gasped out, finally allowing himself to relax after running on pure adrenaline for the past 6 hours. Flopping over onto his back as the waves lapped at his feet, Naruto stared up at the night sky, the remnants of his childlike innocence, marveling at the abundance of stars he could see since there weren't any clouds out that night. The full moon was still low in the sky, having only grown dark out 3 hours ago, which proved irritating since Naruto learned the hard way that sharks like to hunt at night in the waters he had been passing through. It wasn't long before exhaustion began to set in, and try as he might, he couldn't fight off unconsciousness for long, eventually falling asleep. Almost an hour later, a group of shinobi came across the slumbering boy. Is he dead? One of 3 young girls inquired timidly, having never liked the idea of death or killing. The only adult, a woman, knelt down beside him and saw the steady rise and fall of his chest. No, he's just sleeping. She answered before standing up and continuing to walk, wanting to put as much distance between her and Kiri as possible. Hey Kira-sama, we can't just leave him like this. What if the hunter nin find him? One of the other girls called out, stopping the woman, Kira, in her tracks. As much as she couldn't afford to take on another traveling companion, Kira knew that the child had a bloodline from his appearance, and if any of that bastard Yugura's undertakers found the boy, he'd be killed mercilessly and most likely tortured before then, in an attempt to get information on the location of other people with bloodlines. Cursing her slowly awakening maternal instincts, Kira turned back around and picked the boy up without a word before returning to their journey, the 3 girls following behind her as they chatted animatedly about the boy that looked to be about their age. Well, 2 of them did. I wonder how he got here. He doesn't match the description of any bloodline clans I've heard of. The second girl stated curiously while staring up at the boy in their mistress's arms. Maybe he's from another country. But, ouch, and how would he get here? I didn't see any sort of boat or any wreckage, and he couldn't have swam all the way here. The first girl countered while the third one stayed silent, a sheathed tanto gripped in her left hand. Perhaps he's got a new bloodline. Or maybe he doesn't have a bloodline to begin with, but look at his ears, Haku. And he's got claws and fangs, too. Not only that, but he's got all of those weird tattoos. The second girl, ow, argued back, her words making Kira think as she glanced down at the kid she was carrying. He most definitely had a bloodline and she couldn't pinpoint it, but something about the boy's appearance made her feel as if she knew just what kind of bloodline it was, but couldn't remember. She knew of only a few bloodline clans that sported red hair as a common trait, but if he turned out to be a part of that clan, he could either be a priceless ally or a deadly enemy in the future. For now, though, he was just a boy. Kuroiri could only sigh quietly as her two companions continued to ramble on about the mysterious boy. Granted, she was curious about him herself, but she was patient and would wait for her questions to be answered. Gripping her tanto a little tighter, Kuroiri narrowed her eyes slightly. Damn, I must have overslept again, Naruto mumbled as he slowly sat up, yawning as the blanket pulled in his lap. Pausing in mid-stretch, he looked down and blinked with confusion. Blanket? Didn't he pass out on the beach? Where did the blanket come from? Glancing around, he found himself in what appeared to be a cave along the coast, the smoldering remains of a small campfire resting not too far away. Getting up and folding the blanket and travel futon he had been lying on, Naruto quietly made his way to the opening. His eyes narrowed as they adjusted to the mid-morning sunlight, while he ran his fingers through his shaggy and spiky crimson hair. Leaving so soon? Kira spoke up, breaking the silence and startling the redhead, inadvertently making him trip and fall flat on his face, forcing the wind out of his lungs and causing him to accidentally expel a small burst of flames from his lips. Quirking an eyebrow at the seemingly klutzy boy while her previous suspicions about his bloodline were confirmed by the flame breath, Kira watched calmly from her spot, staring down at the red-haired kid from her perch atop the mouth of the cave, her legs hanging over the edge. Don't scare me like that, damn it. Naruto snarled as he jumped to his feet and glared up at the woman. She stood at about 5'11" with smooth shoulder-length black hair, pale skin, and honey-brown eyes. She was dressed simply in a pair of dark blue-gray pants that were snug around her broad hips and shapely rear, while the rest of the leggings were baggy, a sleeveless and midriff-bearing dark blue-gray top with a low-cut collar that was stretched tight over her large F-cup breasts and looked like it barely fit her from the way the top was straining to contain her bust. Dark blue-gray bicep-high fingerless gloves covering most of her arms, white cloth wrappings coiled around her neck and the lower half of her face in the likeness of a cloth face mask, and a kiri-hit-ia tied around her head that was tilted a bit off to the side, while pinning her bangs back so that they didn't get in her eyes. There was a rather obvious lash mark running across the metal plate, marking her as a missing nin. While he didn't know her identity, she was Mamachi Kira Kurara, the succubus of the Bloody Mist and heir Ankiri missing nin, former member of the Seven Swordsmen of the Mist and wielder of Kubikiri Haucho. She was also the second woman to ever make it into the Seven Swordsmen. Who the hell are you, anyway? You're pretty feisty for a brat, aren't you? Kira mumbled quietly while staring down at the boy, who didn't seem all that concerned about anything, really. Well, apart from the fact she startled him, but that was a moot point. So, what's in Uzumaki doing here in Water Country? I thought you were a part of the mainland clans. How did you know I'm in Uzumaki? Naruto questioned quietly, his eyes narrowing dangerously, which impressed Kira slightly. It wasn't often she encountered a child that had seen death and had taken lives, she could tell from the way he tensed his clawed fingers and most of the muscles in his body, obviously having grown used to defending himself at some point in the past. Not many clans have such vibrant red hair, nor do they have bloodlines that give them the ability to actually breathe fire, kid. Well, I've never heard of one having such strange characteristics as you. I know my fair share about a lot of bloodline clans. I had to, having been a participant during the first bloodline purges. Kira answered while dropping down to the ground, bringing Kubikiri Haucho with her, landing in front of the boy with ease, despite the obvious bulk of her Zanbatsu. She was impressed further when he didn't even flinch at the fact she now stood only a couple feet from him, with a massive Zanbatsu resting on her shoulder, standing in front of him and essentially cutting off his ability to leave. Most people, even shinobi, tended to be intimidated at least a little bit whenever they saw her sword. So, are you going to answer my question or not? Naruto stayed silent as he stubbornly tried to walk around her, only to stop in mid-step when he found the edge of Kubikiri level with his throat, but he didn't seem nervous about it in the least. In fact, he slowly turned his head to glare at her before suddenly spitting out a blast of fire. Cursing, Kira was forced to jump back before she was badly burned, just barely avoiding injury, after putting out a small fire on her right wrist that had caught on her glove. As a result, Naruto's path was no longer blocked, but his escape was quickly cut short when Kira threw her Zanbatsu, the massive blade digging into the ground just beyond where Naruto was and a few feet off to the side. Eyes going wide, Naruto couldn't stop in time before his head made contact with the long handle of Kubikiri Haucho, knocking him flat on his back and stunning him momentarily, giving Kira enough time to walk over to him, glaring at him with irritation. You're lucky the girl seemed to like you for whatever reason, or else I just might have killed you for that little stunt, brat. Kira growled out, only to receive a snarl of defiance from the redhead as he got back to his feet. "Stop calling me brat." Kira couldn't stop herself from smirking at the boy's anger, idly noticing that the girls were on their way back from their morning bath. "Oh, yeah? And what are you going to do if I don't, brat?" She taunted, though a part of her warned her not to rile him up so bad, which was quickly ignored and countered with the knowledge that the boy couldn't do anything to seriously hurt her. Her answer was a ball of blazing hot fire that filled her vision, her eyes going wide with shock. "Damn little bastard," Kira growled quietly to herself, sitting in the back of the cave they had taken refuge in with a fierce blush on her face, while glaring venomously at the red-haired hellion that had decided it would be a good idea to torch her clothes. Again. Thankfully, her wrappings were left untouched, keeping her chest and face covered, but her pants hadn't been so lucky, being almost completely burned away like her top had been. She was even luckier that her underwear hadn't been burned also, and that she also kept spare changes of clothes stored in a scroll for emergencies. It was something she had started doing after they first met each other just over 2 years ago, having suffered a similar fate that was much more humiliating back then, since she hadn't been prepared for such a thing to happen, physically or mentally. Said redhead had a rather fiendish and mischievous fanged smirk of victory on his face as he held Kira's gaze, completely ignoring the irate ranting of Ao, who was being held back from beating him up in her moment of female fury by a frantic Haku, who was nervously trying to calm her friend down, while a stoic Kuroiri simply watched from the sidelines with a blank expression. Despite what happened when they first met and after being begged by all three of the girls, which nearly gave her a heart attack since even the ever-emotionless Kuroiri joined in on the collective use of puppy dog eyes and was ironically the most talented at it, Kira had eventually caved in and offered Naruto the choice of traveling with them or not. By offer, Kira hadn't really given Naruto much of a choice in the matter with her tone and the words she used, but it was mostly because she knew the three girls she had taken under her wing would be quite unhappy if he didn't come with them. She absolutely refused to let that happen, but Kira had been smart enough to hide the fact she had a soft spot for the trio of little girls that she was gradually coming to see as her daughters in the, then, short time they had known one another. Now, she was just as much of a mother to the three girls as their birth mothers had been. Hell, in the past 2 years, she had even come to see the tricky and devious little shit, Naruto, as her son, but also refused to admit it out loud. Mostly out of spite for him always burning her clothes or some other cruel act of pyromancy he committed against her every so often. Akasama. Mugetsu Kuroiri, 12 years old, stated calmly from a couple feet away, sitting on her knees with her legs tucked under her and her hands resting in her lap in a formal manner. Having come from a bloodline clan that originally descended from samurai with certain talents, Kuroiri was a firm follower of honor, respect, and loyalty. She was dressed plainly in a pair of baggy black hakama with white stitching, a black long-sleeved turtleneck that clung to her body like a second skin and pronounced her developing B-cup bust, black tabby socks and black wooden jetta on her feet, black fingerless gloves on her hands, and a black cloth face mask tucked into the collar of her top and pulled up over her nose to hide the bottom half of her face. Her waist-length silky raven black hair was pulled back into a high ponytail held in place by a single white hair tie, her prized wakizashi and tanto resting at her left hip. Both swords had a simple, solid black wooden sheath with silver-white metal guards of plain design, their handles bound in black cloth with white diamonds of fabric running along their length, the pommels capped with silver-white metal. While they weren't the greatest of swords, they held sentimental value to her. Naruto, who had been learning how to make weapons during the past year, had offered to make her a wakizashi and a new tanto, since her old one had been broken in the middle of a fight. The metal was only mid-grade, and the edge had to be sharpened more often than usual, but because it had been crafted through the use of Naruto's flame breath, the metal had become chakra conductive by the time they had been finished. So long as she channeled her chakra through them, they were strong enough to hold out against even Kira's Kubikiri Haucho, and sharp enough to cut through rock. She would have to get a new pair soon, however. The blades had served her well, but they had taken too much of a beating during the past 6 months. "What is it, Kuroiri? Is something wrong?" Kira asked calmly, her anger forgotten as she faced the youngest child with Haku being the eldest at 14 and Ao being in the middle at 13. Naruto had just turned 12 roughly 5 months ago, about a month and a half before Kuroiri's own birthday. Kuroiri was quiet for a few moments as she stared down at the ground and thought before speaking up. "I have a bad feeling about the job, Akasama." The young swordswoman in training answered, her usual apathetic monotone having become laced with a hint of worry that Kira was hard-pressed to catch notice of. Instead of asking what it was exactly that bothered her about the mission, which she wanted to do, Kira stayed quiet and let Kuroiri speak. "I believe our client is setting us up, Akasama. I think it might be a trap." Kira was silent for a few moments, honestly having had similar thoughts on the matter. Their client was a wealthy jewelry merchant that wanted them to retrieve some items from a rival dealer of gems and precious metals. Supposedly, one of the items they are to steal is rumored to be a gem with the ability to give someone the power of a dragon, something that had caught Naruto's attention and suspicion, having originally come to Water Country in search of artifacts and relics of his clan that had been hidden away, stolen, or simply lost through history. Said item sounded eerily similar to one of the relics he was looking for. After hearing about that, Naruto had refused to even reconsider not taking the job, being dead set on confirming the rumors about the gem. He had even told them that he would still take the job even if they didn't, but he never let them know as to why. Even in the past 2 years, he had refused to tell them about why he came to Water Country. "You aren't the only one, Kuroyuri, but there isn't anything we can do about that. We can only prepare for the worst and do the mission. We need the money." "Hi, Akasama." Kuroyuri acknowledged, letting go of the subject before returning to her original spot prior to approaching Kira, said woman taking the moment to examine each of her other 3 students. First up was the oldest one, Yuki Haku, who had chocolate brown eyes and long black hair that she kept up in a bun for the most part, with a length of it left to fall to the base of her neck, her chin-length bangs framing her face. She was dressed in a pair of plain black form-fitting pants, a dark blue and light gray camouflage long-sleeved turtleneck that also did little to hide her own blossoming physique and made her C-cup bust more nautical, black gloves on her hands, black sandals on her feet, and a white Kiri Hunter Nin mask that she had stolen off one of the last undertakers sent after them, with a red swirl design painted on it. She was the last member of the Yuki clan, if not one of the last. Blessed with the Hyutin bloodline, Haku was capable of combining wind and water chakra to create ice, opening a great many doors for her in terms of ninjutsu, since wind was primarily an offensive element and water was primarily defensive with some offensive abilities. She would most likely have to invent her own Hyutin techniques, however, if they didn't find any Yuki clan scrolls. Then there was the spirited Yumi Osoao, being the most strangely dressed of the 3 girls. She had emerald green eyes and deep blue hair that she kept quite short, with the only exception being her bangs, which reached down to the tops of her shoulders. Her clothing, which was made of a waterproof material not unlike that of civilian diving suits, was unique, to put it nicely. Revealing was more realistic, but Kira, for the life of her, couldn't figure out what prompted the girl to find her choice in clothing acceptable, let alone proper for a young girl her age. Hell, even Kira wouldn't be caught dead in something like Ao War, and she was the succubus of the bloody mist. Her short-sleeved top consisted of the dark blue waterproof material that covered her arms from the middle of her biceps up to her shoulders, across her upper and middle back, along the top of her shoulders and collarbone, and around her neck all the way up to the base of her jaw, with only a pair of dark blue bands of the material crossing over her chest in an X that attached to the material once more, the bands not even covering half of her B-cup breasts and just barely hiding her nipples from sight. Dark blue tipless gloves of the same material covered the rest of her arms and connected with her sleeves, slender diamonds of electric blue, decorating the inside of her elbows, while a Y-shaped shard of similar electric blue ran along the front of her throat and along the base of her jawline that ended just beneath her ears. The bottom half of her body was no better, being made up of a pair of incredibly small short shorts of the dark blue waterproof material that honestly looked no different than the bottom half of a 2-piece bathing suit or panties. Her legs, from her ankles up to the middle of her thighs, were covered in the exact same dark blue material, with her feet being covered in the material as well, that conformed to her toes like a foot glove, only with thin black soles for padding when she wasn't in the water, without hindering her speed or maneuverability while in the water. Attached to the back of her shorts were 2 kunai holsters of the same dark blue material, both holsters set horizontally and behind either hip. As for Naruto's appearance, he hadn't changed much other than taking to using a pair of wakizashi he had lifted from a dead Kiri Hunter Nin he and Haku had double-teamed, the Hunter Nin being the same one Haku had gotten her mask from. The redhead had taken to wearing them behind his waist, with a sheath slipped under his rope belt and tied to it to keep them in place during rough battles. She, along with Kuroyuri, had been helping him learn how to use them, while she had been teaching him more about water chakra and Suiton techniques. Kira still couldn't get over the way Naruto seemed to soak up everything he was taught like a sponge, nothing escaped him, and whenever he couldn't get something right, it didn't take him long to find a way around it. He had actually made a couple of his own techniques by accident that way, something that shocked the former Kiri Jounin. However, she would only see him perform a technique with hand seals once, and he would eventually disappear for several hours every day, training in private, but every time he used a technique after that, it would be done without hand seals and mostly through raw and pure elemental chakra manipulation. Somehow, the boy was able to achieve something that had only been heard of in the Nidaime Hokage of Konoha, who was said to use powerful Suiton techniques such as Ryudan, with as little as 3 hand seals out of the 2 dozen it normally required. She could only speculate as to how Naruto was capable of learning how to do such unbelievable things, since the only actual possession she knew he had, apart from his clothing, was a single dark crimson scroll with a kanji for dragon in the center in white. Although Naruto had reserves closer to Kira's own, Ao had the highest chakra capacity amongst the girls, her clan having been amongst the strongest water users in all of Water Country. They were also the best swimmers and masters of underwater combat, having the innate ability to hold their breath for as long as 10 minutes, on average, while underwater without any ill effects on their health. Not exactly a bloodline, but the Yonde Mizukage still are considered as such and had them hunted down as well. Ao could also form hand seals drastically faster than her fellow siblings, but Haku had her beat with the ability to form one-handed seals. Then again, Naruto never had a need for hand seals 98% of the time, apparently, so he had them both beat without even actually trying. Kuroyuri, while the slowest in forming hand seals and having the smallest reserves, was the most talented in Kenjutsu and Taijutsu, which was second only to Naruto's, but that was mostly because he was strong enough to break through any guard, making it nearly impossible for someone to safely remain on the defensive against him. Speed-wise, Haku came in first place, hands down. Ao was second to her in that, but also took first place when in the water. Kuroyuri was in third when it came to movement speed, while Naruto was, by far, the slowest of them, but his speed and agility in the water was second only to Ao's, something that kind of surprised Kira. The only thing she couldn't help them with was Genjutsu for all four of them, seeing as she wasn't exactly skilled at it herself, while Naruto was simply incapable of using it to begin with, but she also couldn't help Naruto with his fire and earth affinities, having only a water affinity herself. Thus, Naruto had taken to learning how to forge weapons to build up his fire affinity, while trying to figure out, through trial and error, how to create metals by compressing select minerals in the earth to help strengthen his earth affinity. This particular part wasn't going so well. Kira was silent for a few more minutes as she dismissed her thoughts for later, noticing what time it was. Waiting for Ao to finally stop trying to attack Naruto, Kira cleared her throat and gained the attention of all four of her students' children traveling companions. Get ready. It's almost time for us to head out for the mission. Hi. The three girls acknowledged respectfully before going about packing up their belongings, while Naruto simply yawned and leaned back against the wall. Although it wasn't the first time, Kira knew it wouldn't be the last time she wondered about her only son. He didn't have any sort of camping equipment, such as a tent or sleeping bag, nothing. She had been concerned about that when they first started traveling together, but learned quickly that there was a reason why he didn't have any. He didn't need any of it. His body was simply too warm for him to get cold. He seemed pretty comfortable with sleeping outside on the bare ground, no matter what it was, and he had told them only a couple things about his past, one of them being that he had been hunting for his food daily since he was 7 and he was quite good at it. He had also told them that he had been living out in the wild for about just as long. Dismissing her thoughts, Kira started packing her own things, focusing her attention back on the mission. Namyuk Village was a peaceful little town on Water Country's far eastern shore that sat near the base of a seaside cliff, but the waters were almost always calm, even during severe storms, making it a rather nice place to live. Like its name stated, Namyuk Village was still protected from the ocean by a rather thick and long wall of stone that separated the outskirts of town from the gentle waves that lapped at the smooth rock, just in case a truly powerful storm comes and causes any seriously large waves that could possibly damage the town. That night was no different than any other. The stars shined in the sky around a full moon, a touch of fog veiling the village, but not by much. Suddenly, 3 girls and a grown woman were sent flying through a door just moments before the warehouse they had previously been occupying was instantly devoured by a devastating explosion. Naruto. Kuroyuri suddenly screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. He had sacrificed himself so that they could live. She could only stare at the flaming wreckage of the warehouse with wide onyx eyes that reflected the destruction before her, even as 24 Kiri Hunter Nin landed all around them in a complete circle, 5 being Jounin level and 7 of them being Chunin. Dragged off the ground from her knees and to her feet by Haku, Kuroyuri didn't outwardly react at all. She didn't exactly hear what one of the Hunter Nin said, but she knew it was an insult to Naruto, judging from the mocking laughter of a few of the Hunter Nin around him as he glanced back at the ruins of the warehouse. Before anyone could say or do anything, Kuroyuri had already drawn her blades and charged forward, pushing herself to move faster than she ever had before as she charged her swords with her chakra, coating the blades in a condensed shell of pale blue energy. No one moved as 3 Hunter Nin instantly lost their lives when Kuroyuri swung her wakizashi, bisecting them at the waist in a single move. Don't insult Naruto Sama, she hissed through her tears, gritting her teeth as she became filled with rage, never noticing how her black eyes slowly started fading to gray before coming pure white, the pupil of either eye slowly shifting to become a thin ring instead of a solid dot. The chakra coating her swords flickered slightly before slowly turning a more silvery white color. Spinning around on her heel, she used a technique Naruto had been helping her create, swinging her wakizashi in a horizontal arc while expelling the chakra shell that had coated it. Jutsuga. The crescent blade of silver chakra shot forward at speeds none of them had expected, cleaving through another 4 hunter nin, 3 managing to escape its straight-away path. Having used up the rest of her available chakra with that one attack, however, Kuroi's eyes shifted back to normal and dropped to her knees, gasping for breath and barely staying conscious. Unfortunately, the only ones that Kuroi had killed had been the 7 Chunin level hunter nin, very impressive for her, but the danger was still very great. After that, all hell broke loose. Suiton. Subin. One of the remaining 5 hunter nin exclaimed before a thin tendril of water lashed out at Kuroi, only to strike the flat of Kubikiri, as Kira used it like a shield to protect the exhausted and distraught aspiring swordswoman. Ao was already flashing through hand seals alongside Haku, both using the exact same technique with surprising skill. Suiton. Suryuiden. Both girls cried out, causing twin serpents of water to rise from the sea and bear down on the 5 undertakers, forcing them to split up lest they lose their lives. One broke to the far right and another to the far left, only to be intercepted by Ao and Haku, while the remaining 3 were left to Kira. Despite them being jounin, the 2 young girls held the advantage of surprise, as well as unique skills that caught their targets off guard, resulting in their swift deaths. Haku's fell to her senbon and newly finished Hyun. Makyo Hayasho technique before having his throat slit open while Ao's was kicked out over the seawall, only to be dragged down under the depths and held there until the masked woman drowned. Kira, having a bit more trouble, had cleaved one of the hunter nin in half early on, but was struggling to fend off both of the remaining shinobi simultaneously. Kuroi was nearly catatonic as she remained on her knees, slumped over slightly as she stared at the ground with teary eyes, unable to believe that Naruto had actually died. Hearing the clash of blades, she was slowly drawn from her stupor to find Kira having trouble with the 2 hunter nin. Slowly reaching into a pocket as her black eyes slowly regained their light and strength, Kuroi retrieved something that Naruto had taught her, Haku, and Ao how to make themselves, soldier pills. It was more of a last resort than anything for them, since they didn't last as long as the more common store-bought soldier pills, but it had been something that had let them survive and defeat several teams of hunter nin in the past. Popping the pill into her mouth and biting down on it, Kuroi forced herself to her feet, her swords gripped tightly in her hands. "Gee, this is getting tiresome, bitch." The male hunter nin growled as his katana was blocked yet again by Kira's Zanbatsu, only to get kicked in the chest and knocked back several meters. Spinning around, Kira ducked under the female hunter nin's katana, causing the masked woman to pass her up and revealing an opening in her guard. Continuing with the rotation, Kira took advantage of her exposed back and swung Kubikiri, easily cutting the woman in half at the waist. However, Kira's victory was short-lived as she was forced to block another attack from the sole surviving hunter nin's katana. Blocking another attack, Kira was caught off guard when the man amplified his strength with chakra, pushing her back slightly, but it was enough to unbalance her. Just as the man rose his katana to finish her off, he suddenly stopped suddenly for a wakizashi blade covered in silver chakra to stick out of his chest. It was quickly followed up by a similarly glowing tanto to be stabbed into the base of his neck, only for both blades to snap at their bases, just above their guards. The body fell forward and remained motionless. That was for Naruto-sama. Kuroi rasped out through her heavy breathing, glaring down at the dead hunter nin. Calming back down, Kuroi slowly sunk back down to her knees, allowing herself to break down into tears as she gripped the now bladeless handles of her wakizashi and tanto to her chest. Sensing more chakra signatures heading their way, Kira knew they didn't have time to waste and instead of arguing, simply picked Kuroi up and started running with Ao and Haku right beside her. Had they stayed only 5 more minutes, they would have seen a large piece of sheet metal get shoved aside, along with a few burning rafters, some mangled scrap metal, and bits of rock. Standing up from where he had been buried, Naruto grunted quietly before realizing he was standing in the middle of a fire, but he wasn't getting burned. Looking down at the necklace that now hung around his neck, Naruto watched as the green gem glowed brightly before the light seemingly transferred over to his body, causing him to glow for a moment before it vanished. Weird, he mumbled before stepping out of the wreckage and over to where the brief battle had taken place, noticing the bodies. Suddenly picking up the scents and sounds of approaching enemies, Naruto drew his pair of wakizashi in reverse grips, spinning around to face them just as they landed in a semicircle. It was only 8 hunter nin, the strongest of them only being high chunin in skill. They had been the backup team that was to come in after a few minutes to give the primary team any assistance if their targets were still alive by the time they arrived. However, the initial team was dead. "What the hell what happened here?" the leader exclaimed, suddenly feeling nervous. Not afraid, but nervous. Nervousness quickly became anger when he saw the body of his older brother, the last hunter nin to have been killed. You killed my brother." "What?" Naruto muttered quietly in confusion, only to growl as he was forced to dodge a ninjato, which was quickly followed up by several other attacks from the rest of the hunter nin. Snarling as his temper started to get the better of him, Naruto gathered a large amount of chakra in his lungs, his eyes flashing yellow for a moment before he exhaled. The screams of 3 hunter nin filled the air as they were swallowed up by the flames, going silent after only a few seconds as they were incinerated. Strangely enhanced battle instincts roared out at him, making him lean back and to the side just in time to avoid having a new breathing hole forcefully carved into his neck. Getting angrier by the moment, Naruto's eyes flashed yellow once more without him knowing before he flipped his wakizashi into standard forward grips, only to breathe fire on them and wreathe them in his flames. Spinning around to his left, Naruto blocked a swing from a hunter nin's katana with his left wakizashi, only for his second blade to clash with the katana, spitting flaming embers and superheated sparks from the contact that made the man flinch back, inadvertently giving Naruto the opening he needed. Continuing the spin, Naruto thrust his right wakizashi into the man's side and up into his ribcage, skewering his heart and searing the wound. Yanking the blade free, Naruto jumped back to avoid being crushed by the zanbatsu used by one of the other hunter nin. "Leave him alone." Naruto suddenly bellowed, his eyes staying yellow this time as he expelled an even more intense blaze of fire than before, causing the gathered hunter nin to scatter. They were thankful that they had planned ahead and evacuated most of the people in the town prior to springing their trap, or else things might have taken a turn for the worst. The gout of flames, quickly destroying numerous buildings that were caught in its path. They were quickly being forced onto the defensive, however, as Naruto released another blast of fire before engaging another hunter nin. After that day, word of a red devil would spread like wildfire. And fucking prick, Naruto snarled, now 13, as he removed the crimson bracers and greaves from the limbs of his latest hunt. It had been a meager C-rank Konoha nuke nin hiding out in Water Country Administrationist the Bloodline Civil War to keep Konoha hunter nin from tracking him down, and with Kiri hunter nin focusing on people with bloodlines, it was actually easier to hide than people thought. What made him so important for Naruto to hunt him down was the fact he possessed pieces of his clan's relics, the bracers and greaves. They had been made and used by one of the original slayers that enhanced a person's earth affinity, giving them a passive ability that made it much harder to cut them. Much like the gem hanging from his neck, the pieces of armor glowed green for a moment after he put them on before the light transferred over to Naruto's body, a sign that the ability it granted the wearer had been activated. Being a slayer, the abilities were more like permanent enhancements for Naruto, but they would only be at full strength, so long as he was wearing the items and half strength when he wasn't. Growling quietly under his breath as he felt the armor pieces start chafing slightly, even though he had just put them on, Naruto made a mental note to get some wrappings to keep from getting any irritating blisters or something. He may have a healing factor, but it didn't exactly hold up very well against stupid little things like blisters for some reason. It was another reason why he went without sandals or any other form of footwear, though the claws on his toes helped in his argument with all the traveling and walking he did, it made footwear rather uncomfortable. Grumbling quietly under his breath about having to swim back across the ocean he swore never to swim across again, Naruto started making his way towards Water Country's eastern coast, now that he had found just about all of the Uzumaki clan relics rumored to be on the continent. Thankful for starting to learn Fuinjutsu early on in his travels, Naruto's pants were waterproof as well as fireproof, mostly to protect from his own use of fire, and he had gotten them in a larger size than he should be wearing, mostly because the extra length on the leggings, when coupled with being waterproof, made it far easier for him to swim like he does, giving him something akin to flippers over his feet. He still hated how people called him a merman with how he swims. He couldn't help it if that particular method felt the most comfortable. Fucking stupid reputation, can't take a boat across the ocean now because of it, Naruto growled quietly to himself, just knowing that he was going to get attacked by sharks, like last time, the moment he got close to the mainland. After the fiasco in Namek, he had quickly become known as the Red Devil, a demon that had ruthlessly destroyed an entire town in his senseless rampage. In truth, he had simply gotten a bit too fire-happy during the fight, and even then, only a third of the village had actually suffered any damage. The whole Red Devil thing was easily explained due to his hair and eye color and his pants, but still did those stupid gossipers have to call him an actual demon, of all things. He just knew that that, too, was going to come back and bite him in the ass later. Stupid rumors have probably already reached the mainland by Nojizi. Hope Kira and the others are doing okay. I haven't seen them for a long time, now the redhead mused silently as he neared the beach, which was, ironically, the same one he had reached when he came to Water Country. Wading into the water, Naruto decided to head for Earth Country next, having heard of a pair of short swords made of bone being somewhere within its borders that sounded almost exactly like a pair of bone swords made from a dragon's fangs that his clan had owned early on in their history. What if Naruto Dragon Bloodline Council bashing? Thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.